Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we're diving into something that will make you genuinely grateful for your thermostat, your insulated walls, and honestly, your entire existence in the modern world. We're talking about the remarkable, stubborn, frequently disgusting, and absolutely awe-inspiring ways that medieval peasants survived winter. Not winter like, oh, it's a bit chilly, I should grab a jacket. Winter like a slow, grinding, months-long war against the cold that claimed lives, froze livestock in their fields, and turned ordinary nights into a genuine test of whether you'd be alive by morning. These weren't dramatic warriors with swords. They weren't kings or queens wrapped in ermine fur. They were farmers and laborers and millers and tanners, people whose names history never bothered to write down, and yet somehow, generation after generation, they faced the worst that the European winter could throw at them and they kept going. So before we get into this, if you're enjoying the channel, drop a like and subscribe. I genuinely love to know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. It's one of my favorite parts of doing this. Now get comfortable, maybe pour yourself something warm, and let's begin. When most people picture the Middle Ages, they conjure up something from a film. Stone castles, feasting halls, roaring fires big enough to roast an ox. And yes, that world existed for about 2% of the population. For the other 98%, the ones actually holding the whole thing together with their calloused hands and aching backs, winter was something else entirely. It was a recurring nightmare that started around October and didn't let go until March or April, if you were lucky. Picture yourself in the English countryside or the fields of northern France or the lowlands of Germany, somewhere in the years between 1100 and 1400. The harvest is done. The days are shrinking. The temperature is dropping. And you're standing outside a home that is, let's be honest, barely a step above a well-organized pile of sticks. Your entire world is about to become a fight for survival, and you haven't even eaten dinner yet. The thing that strikes you first about medieval peasant housing, if you were able to walk into one, is that you can see your breath. Inside. The house hasn't even gotten cold yet. This is the baseline. This is normal. Because the walls of these structures, built from wattle and daub, which is the technical term for sticks woven together and plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal manure, were never really designed to be airtight. They were designed to be cheap. They were designed to be buildable by people who owned almost nothing and needed shelter by winter or they would die. And they worked, just barely, just enough, which in the medieval world was considered a genuine achievement. The roof overhead was thatched, bundles of dried reeds or straw layered over a timber frame. It kept most of the rain out, most of the time. After a few seasons of weathering, it also developed small gaps that let in the cold, the occasional sparrow, and if you were particularly unfortunate, a family of rats who had made themselves extremely comfortable up there and had no intention of leaving. The floor was dirt, not stone, not wood, dirt, packed down by years of feet walking over it, maybe scattered with old rushes or straw for some thin illusion of warmth underfoot, but dirt nonetheless. In winter, the cold radiated upward through it like the earth itself had decided to take sides against you. You could pile on more straw. You could try to lay branches or old boards. But the cold kept coming, patient and relentless. An enemy that never got tired, never needed to sleep, and never ran out of ammunition. Windows, if your particular hut had them, were either non-existent or tiny holes covered by a piece of scraped animal hide stretched thin enough to let in a little light while theoretically blocking the wind. The key word there being theoretically. A proper storm would rip that covering right off the wall, leaving a gaping hole through which the full fury of winter poured like water through a broken dam. On those nights, you simply stuffed the hole with whatever you could find and prayed for morning. And then there was the door. Usually a single plank or series of planks, hung on iron hinges if you were lucky, on leather straps if you weren't. The gaps around its edges let in thin, whistling blades of cold air all night long. Peasants would press old rags and moss and handfuls of straw into the cracks, which helped a little. The wind always found the ones they missed. So this was the arena. This was the battlefield. On one side, the medieval winter, temperatures routinely below freezing, storms that could last for days, cold that killed children and elderly people who simply couldn't generate enough heat to survive the night. On the other side, one family, maybe 6 to 10 people, in a single room hut the size of a modern studio apartment. No heating system beyond a central fire. No insulation beyond what they could stuff into the walls with their own hands. No warm drinks on demand, no electric blankets, no backup plan. Just grit, resourcefulness, and a deeply human refusal to simply give up. And somehow, more often than not, they made it through. The walls between you and death. If you've ever stood next to a drafty window on a winter night and felt that cold finger of air sneaking through the gap, you have a faint, distant, incredibly mild approximation of what a medieval peasant felt all night, every night from November to March. Except their entire house was that window. Wattle and daub construction was, in its own way, a marvel. It required no specialized tools, no expensive materials, and no formal training. You cut flexible branches, usually hazel or willow, and wove them between upright timber posts like a giant basket. Then you mixed your daub. This is where the recipe gets interesting. Clay soil, chopped straw for binding, water, and crucially, animal dung. Cattle, horse, pig, whatever was available. Dung dried into a surprisingly hard, relatively waterproof material. It was free. It was everywhere on a medieval farm, and it worked well enough that this building technique persisted for centuries in poorer parts of Europe. Practical, effective, and deeply unromantic. The problem was that wattle and daub didn't age particularly well. The clay cracked as it dried. The wooden frame shifted slightly with each season's freeze and thaw, opening up new gaps. Mice and rats tunneled through the base of the walls looking for shelter and food, leaving holes that the wind immediately claimed as its own. After 5 or 10 years, a peasant home was essentially held together by accumulated repairs, each patch covering the last patch. The whole thing gradually becoming a kind of archaeological record of every winter that had come before. Each autumn, families would undertake a kind of pre-winter maintenance ritual. They walked the perimeter of their home with eyes trained on the wall, looking for new cracks, new gaps, places where daylight showed through that shouldn't be there. Each one had to be addressed. Fresh daub was mixed and pressed in. Gaps were stuffed with moss, which was gathered from the banks of streams and was an excellent insulator for its size. Wool scraps, old cloth, handfuls of sheep's fleece that hadn't made it into yarn, all of these went into the cracks. Some families used rendered animal fat, rubbed into the outer surface of the walls, to repel water and seal the smallest gaps that fingers couldn't reach. The smell was extraordinary, in a way that you would not enjoy. The roofs required their own attention. A thatch roof in good repair was actually remarkably effective at insulation, the air trapped between the layers of straw acting almost like a modern insulating bat. But good repair was the operative phrase. Thatch compressed under snow, sagged under repeated soakings, and developed thin patches where water found its way through. A bad winter roof meant a wet, cold family, and in medieval conditions, wet and cold was a combination that killed. So autumn meant climbing up and checking the thatch, pressing in fresh bundles where the old ones had worn thin, and reinforcing the ridge at the top where leaks most commonly started. The floors presented a different challenge. You couldn't fix a dirt floor the way you could patch a wall. What you could do was layer it. Dried rushes went down first, those long, slender waterside grasses that were harvested in late summer and dried in the sun. They provided a thin but genuine buffer between your feet and the frozen ground. Over those, straw. Over the straw, sometimes bracken fern, which packed more densely and lasted longer than straight straw. The whole layered assembly did two things. It insulated the floor slightly against the cold rising from the earth, and it created a kind of cushioning that made standing and sitting on the bare ground marginally less miserable. The problem was the organic nature of all of it. Rushes and straw rotted. They got wet from spilled water, from condensation, from the dripping noses of children and animals alike. They picked up food scraps and turned into a fermentation project that smelled about as pleasant as you'd expect. Most families didn't pull the whole lot up and replace it regularly, partly because that took time and energy they didn't have, and partly because adding fresh layers on top of old ones built up a thick, dense mat that actually insulated the floor quite effectively. Like compost, which is essentially what it was. Visitors to medieval homes often commented, with varying degrees of horror, on the layered state of the floor, which could be several inches deep in accumulated organic matter, and housed its own complex ecosystem of insects, worms, and fungus. In winter, the peasants didn't care. The floor was warm. Everything else could wait. The fire, god, companion, tyrant. At the center of the peasant home, both physically and spiritually, was the fire. Not a fireplace in the modern sense, not a contained, managed, safely vented appliance, but a fire. An open hearth, nothing more than a shallow pit dug into the dirt floor or a flat arrangement of stones, from which the smoke was theoretically meant to rise and escape through a hole in the thatch above. Theoretically. In practice, the smoke went everywhere. It filled the room to the height of about 4 or 5 feet, creating a permanent lower layer of breathable air and an upper layer that would have had modern health and safety inspectors fainting on the spot. The beams of the roof were permanently blackened. The thatch above darkened to a deep, oily brown over the years. Every surface in the house had a fine coating of particulate matter. Everyone who lived in a medieval peasant home smelled like a campfire all the time, inescapably. Their clothes smelled like it. Their hair smelled like it. Their skin smelled like it. This was not a condition they considered unusual, because it was the only condition they had ever known. But the fire, smoky and temperamental as it was also the difference between living and not living. It provided warmth, the only warmth available. It cooked food, which was both nutrition and an additional source of internal heat. It dried wet clothing and wet people. It provided light in the months when darkness fell in mid-afternoon and didn't lift until well past dawn. And it served as a social hub, a gathering point around which the family sat together in the evenings, talking, mending, telling stories, because there was literally nothing else to do after dark, and moving away from the fire meant entering the frozen periphery of the room where your toes would begin to go numb within minutes. The fire demanded constant management. The fuel it consumed was not unlimited. Wood had to be gathered through the autumn, cut, split, and stacked to dry. Wet wood burned poorly, produced enormous amounts of smoke, and gave relatively little heat. Dry wood was precious. In areas where wood was scarce, peasants burned peat, cut from bogs in thick dark bricks that smoldered slowly and gave a different kind of heat, lower flame but long-lasting. In coastal areas, dried seaweed and even animal bones were thrown on in lean times. Anything that would burn, anything. The management of fuel was a year-round concern. Peasants with access to common woodland, that shared resource that lords frequently tried to restrict, gathered fallen branches and dead wood through the warmer months. Children as young as 6 or 7 were sent out with bundles on their backs to collect sticks. The right to gather wood, called estovers in medieval legal language, was one of the most fiercely protected communal rights in village society, because everyone understood that losing access to fuel in winter wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. At night, when the household was finally ready to sleep, the fire couldn't simply be left to burn itself down to nothing. Rebuilding a fire from a cold hearth in the dark of a frozen winter morning was a genuinely difficult, time-consuming, and in severe cold, dangerous undertaking. The tools available were flint and steel, struck together over a small pile of tinder, usually dried fungus, charred cloth, or fine fibrous material that would catch a spark. Getting a spark was one thing. Getting it to grow into a flame required calm, precise breath, and careful tending. Frozen fingers made the whole process much harder. So the fire was banked. This is one of the truly elegant survival techniques that medieval people developed through accumulated experience across generations. Before sleeping, you carefully rake the hot coals and embers together into a compact pile at the center of the hearth. Then you covered them in a thick layer of fine ash. Not too much air, not too little. The ash acted as an insulating blanket, cutting the oxygen supply enough that the coals couldn't fully combust, but maintaining enough heat that they continued to glow slowly through the night. Done correctly, a banked fire could hold its heat for 8 to 10 hours. In the morning, you removed the ash layer, found the still glowing coals beneath, added kindling and then wood, and the fire was back within minutes. No cold start, no fumbling with flint and steel with numb fingers, no terrifying gap in warmth during the coldest hours. Done incorrectly, you woke to a cold hearth and a very unpleasant morning. Too much ash smothered the coals completely. Too little ash let them burn through. A draft finding its way in through the night could snuff them entirely. Families with young adults or teenagers often had someone sleep nearest the fire, assigned to check on the coals in the small hours and add a log if they were burning down too fast. This wasn't a chore that anyone welcomed. Being the person who had to get up at 3 in the morning, crawl out from the warm pile of family members, and crouch over a smoky fire in a freezing room was, by all accounts, miserable. But it was necessary. The fire was the heartbeat of the household. Let it stop, and everything else stopped with it. The warmth of BODIS. Here is something that sounds primitive and perhaps slightly horrifying by modern standards, and yet was one of the single most effective survival strategies available to medieval peasants. They slept in piles. Not metaphorically, literally. The entire household, parents, children, grandparents, older relatives, and frequently guests who couldn't safely travel home in a storm, all arranged themselves together in the warmest part of the room, as close to the hearth as safely possible, layered under every scrap of cloth and blanket the household owned, pressed together for the simple and vital reason that human bodies generate heat, and multiple human bodies generate more heat than one. This is biology. The human body at rest produces roughly the same amount of heat as a 75-watt light bulb. In a room full of bodies, that adds up. The medieval peasants didn't have the physics vocabulary to explain why this worked. They just knew that it did, and they did it accordingly, without the slightest embarrassment or hesitation, because the alternative was suffering or dying from cold, and those were not acceptable alternatives. The sleeping arrangements were not particularly comfortable by any modern measure. Beds were a luxury that many poorer peasant families didn't have in any recognizable modern form. The bedding was typically a large sack, made from rough-woven cloth, stuffed with straw, hay, or dried bracken fern. This was laid on the floor, or occasionally on a low wooden platform, and the household climbed onto and around it. The softer the stuffing, the more insulating it was, but straw compacted under body weight and needed to be refreshed regularly. Fresh straw was warmer. Old, compressed straw was cold and lumpy and home to any number of small creatures. Fleas were a constant companion of medieval life and were particularly active in bedding. The straw was an ideal habitat, warm and protected, and fleas abandoned it at night to feed on the humans sleeping on top of it and return to it by day. There was no effective remedy for this. You accepted the fleas. You scratched. You moved on. By medieval standards, a flea infestation was simply the normal condition of existence, not a problem to be solved. The arrangement of bodies in the sleeping pile was not entirely random. Infants and very young children, who were most vulnerable to cold and most dangerous to position near the fire due to risk of burns and sparks, were tucked into the center of the human pile, surrounded on all sides by the body heat of older family members. The oldest and most frail adults were also given favored positions, not quite center but well insulated by the bodies around them. Older children and teenagers, who were more resilient to cold and more capable of generating their own heat through the night, often ended up on the outer edges of the pile where they served, whether they liked it or not. as a kind of living windbreak for the more vulnerable family members inside. Nobody asked these teenagers if they were comfortable with this arrangement. That is not how medieval family dynamics worked. Animals, where they were permitted inside, added their own significant contribution to the warmth budget. A full-grown cow generates an enormous amount of heat, roughly equivalent to a small electric space heater running continuously. In a closed room, even a couple of animals could raise the ambient temperature by several degrees, which in a situation where the difference between survival and hypothermia might be 3 or 4 degrees, was genuinely significant. The smell was something that modern sensibilities struggle to fully appreciate. Wet wool, unwashed bodies, animal dung, hay, smoke, the sour tang of old rushes, the faint sweetness of slightly rotting straw, all of it layered together in a small space with no ventilation worth mentioning. But medieval noses were medieval noses. They were accustomed to it from birth. The scent that would have sent a modern person gasping for the door was simply the smell of home, of warmth, of safety, of family. And in winter, home was the best place in the world. Livestock, the four-legged furnaces. If you had animals in the medieval world, and every farming family did, then winter was when those animals earned their keep in a way that went well beyond their agricultural utility. They were, in the most literal possible sense, a source of heat, and medieval peasants were not about to waste that. The practice of bringing livestock inside for winter was not universal across all of medieval Europe in all periods, but it was widespread enough in colder northern climates to have been common, accepted, and thoroughly unsentimental. You did it because it worked, because it kept the animals alive when they might have frozen in an uninsulated barn, and because it kept the humans warmer in the process. Two problems solved simultaneously. Medieval peasants didn't have a lot of patience for solutions that only addressed one problem at a time. The animals that came inside varied by family, by region, and by the severity of the winter. Small livestock, chickens and goats, were most commonly brought in. Chickens provided surprisingly useful warmth for their size and roosted contentedly in any elevated position they could find, including the rafters, from which they occasionally dropped things onto the people sleeping below, which was unpleasant for everyone. Goats were warmer than chickens, more stubborn about going where you wanted them to go, and possessed of a personality that could best be described as challenging. But they were warm, and in winter, warm was everything. Larger animals, cattle and pigs, came indoors in some households during the most severe cold spells. A cow is an extraordinary heat generator and will stand quietly in an enclosed space without causing much trouble beyond the obvious contributions it makes to the floor's agricultural enrichment. Some medieval homes were literally designed with this dual purpose in mind, a longhouse plan where one end housed the family and the other end housed the animals, separated by a low partition that kept the animals mostly contained while allowing their body heat to flow through. The animals were downhill from the family to allow drainage to move in the right direction. Medieval engineers had thought about this. A barn full of even a few animals, a cow or two, some goats, several pigs, could maintain a temperature several degrees above freezing even during harsh cold spells, simply from the collective metabolic output of those animals. Move the family into that space, or move the animals into the family space, and you've created a crude but functional shared heating system that required no fuel, no maintenance, and no engineering beyond the simple act of opening the door and letting them in. The downsides, and there were downsides, were primarily sensory and sanitary. Livestock produce manure continuously. Livestock in a small enclosed space produce manure in quantities that would necessitate regular removal, except that in winter, removing manure meant going outside into the cold to dispose of it, which reduced incentives significantly. The accumulation of manure on the floor raised the organic matter level, which combined with the straw and rushes already there, created a deep, warm, composting layer that was actually slightly helpful for insulation purposes, but aggressive in its impact on air quality. Medieval people developed what modern psychologists might call selective sensory filtering. When your entire world smells the same, you stop smelling it. The overwhelming scent of a shared winter between humans and livestock was not something medieval peasants commented on in their own writings, because it was not unusual or notable to them. It was simply life. Modern visitors to historical reconstructions of medieval farms regularly report that the smell alone is striking enough to stop them in their tracks. Medieval peasants would have found that reaction baffling. Clothing as armor. When you cannot make your environment warmer, you make your body more resistant to the cold. Medieval peasants understood this intuitively and applied it with the same practical ingenuity they applied to everything else in their survival toolkit. The philosophy was simple: wear everything you own, all the time from October to April, and hope it's enough. The foundational layer was linen, when a family could afford it, or rough-woven hemp cloth when they couldn't. A simple undershirt-style tunic, reaching to the thighs or knees, worn directly against the skin. Linen is actually a decent base layer in cold weather, absorbing moisture from the skin and helping to regulate temperature, though medieval peasant linen was a considerably rougher and scratchier product than anything you'd find in a modern fabric shop. The degree of itchiness was, by all accounts, substantial. This was considered normal and was not seen as a reason to remove the garment. Over this went the primary tunic, wool, in a heavier weave than the underlayer. Wool is genuinely excellent cold weather material, one of the best natural fibers available for insulation, and medieval people knew this through generations of experience even without the science to explain why. Wool fibers crimp and interlock in a way that traps air, providing insulation even when wet, which was a critical property in a world where getting rained on was unavoidable and had no immediate solution. The color was whatever the wool had been dyed with using available plant materials, which meant a lot of earthy browns, dull yellows, muddy greens, and the natural off-white of undyed fleece. Multiple wool tunics, layered over each other, was the standard cold weather strategy. You wore 2 if you had them, 3 if you were particularly cold or particularly lucky. The outer layer picked up the wind-borne dirt, the mud splashes, the grease from cooking fires and animal handling. The inner layers stayed relatively cleaner and maintained their insulating properties better. This is not fundamentally different from how modern layering systems work for outdoor clothing, just significantly itchier and considerably more fragrant. Over all of this went a cloak, the most visible and most variable item in the medieval peasant wardrobe. Cloaks ranged from a single piece of rough wool cloth, essentially a large rectangle with a hole for the head or a simple fastening at the shoulder, to more elaborate constructions for those who could afford them. The key function was wind resistance. A cloak that wrapped around the body blocked the wind from stealing heat through the layers underneath. It also provided an additional layer of insulation. And it could be wrapped tighter or looser depending on conditions, giving some degree of adjustability to the system. Sheepskin was used when available, and it was excellent, providing both the insulating lanolin-rich fleece on one side and a windproof hide on the other. A sheepskin cloak was a significant piece of equipment, the closest thing available to a modern insulated jacket, and it was treated accordingly. Sheepskins were repaired rather than replaced, passed down through families, patched and restitched until they were more repair than original material. The extremities were the most vulnerable and the most creatively addressed. Feet were wrapped in layers of cloth, starting with a primary wrapping of linen or soft wool, then overwrapped with a coarser material. Over all of this went leather shoes if the family had them, or wooden clogs, which provided a solid barrier against the wet ground but communicated cold quite effectively. Many peasants added an extra wool wrapping inside the shoe, stuffed in against the foot, to improve insulation. This compressed uncomfortably and required adjustment throughout the day, but it kept toes functional. Hands were covered with simple mittens or gloves made from wool or leather, often both, a wool lining inside a leather outer. The simplest mittens were just two pieces of wool cloth stitched together. The most sophisticated were carefully fitted, with individual fingers made from scraps of hide too small for other purposes. Either way, they were made by hand in the household, usually by the women, because no peasant family was buying gloves when wool and leather were available and needles existed. The head was taken seriously. The ears and back of the neck are major heat loss points, and medieval people without the physiology vocabulary knew this from experience. Simple woolen caps pulled down over the ears were universal in cold weather. Wrapped hoods that covered the head and pulled close around the face were common in northern climates. A wrapped face, breathing through wool, warmed the air before it reached the lungs. This was not just comfort. It was medical survival, reducing the risk of the cold-induced lung conditions that were a major killer in winter. Washing the clothing was essentially not done in winter. The reasons were practical. Water froze or was ice cold. Drying wet clothing in a cold, poorly ventilated space took days and left the clothing damp in the meantime, which was worse than unwashed. And critically, repeated washing reduced the natural lanolin content of wool fibers, diminishing their water-repelling properties. A clean medieval wool cloak was actually slightly less effective in rain than a dirty one. The oil content built up over weeks of wearing helped shed water. The pragmatic medieval peasant took this as nature's way of saying that laundry could wait until spring. The strategic value of being dirty. This deserves its own discussion because it runs so dramatically counter to modern assumptions about cleanliness and health that it can seem like a joke. It wasn't. Medieval peasants who didn't wash their clothing in winter were, by the best available evidence, making a sound, practical decision that improved their survival odds. They just didn't know the science behind it, which is fine, because the result was the same whether you understood the mechanism or not. Wool fibers, as mentioned, contain lanolin, a natural wax secreted by sheep. When you wash wool, you remove this lanolin, and the fibers lose some of their water repellency. Never washed wool keeps more of its natural protective properties. Medieval wool cloth was not heavily processed, and the lanolin content was therefore higher than in modern commercial wool, making this effect more pronounced. Beyond lanolin, there's the matter of the other things that accumulated on a medieval peasant's clothing over weeks of winter wear. Body oil, which humans secrete naturally and continuously, saturated the fibers of the clothing closest to the skin. This oil is hydrophobic, water-repelling, and added another layer of weather protection to the innermost garments. The outer layers picked up a coating of dirt, grease from cooking and animal handling, and a general patina of medieval outdoor life that, while thoroughly revolting to modern sensibilities, filled in the micro-gaps in the fabric and reduced its air permeability. Effectively, a deeply dirty medieval cloak was a more windproof medieval cloak. None of this means that medieval peasants were happy to be dirty. They understood cleanliness as a value and washed when they could. But in winter, when washing meant exposure to cold water and a prolonged period with wet clothing you couldn't effectively dry, the calculation came down firmly on the side of staying dirty and staying warm. The spring cleaning that followed, when every item of clothing was washed, beaten, aired, and scrubbed, was a cultural institution. It was also a genuine relief. There's also the matter of body odor as a social normalizer. In a community where everyone smelled the same, where the baseline scent of human existence was a combination of wood smoke, animal, wool, and organic matter, the concept of smelling bad had a much higher threshold than it does today. Social gatherings, church services, market days, all of these involved proximity to many people who smelled exactly as you did. The olfactory environment of the medieval world was simply different, and the peasants navigating it had no frame of reference that would make them find it objectionable. What they ate and why it kept them alive. The relationship between diet and warmth in medieval winter was not articulated in medical or scientific terms by the people living it, but it was deeply understood through generations of practical experience. You ate more in winter. You ate heavier things in winter. You ate before sleeping whenever you possibly could, even if what you were eating was not particularly appetizing. And this wasn't just about not going hungry. It was about using your own metabolism as a supplementary heating system. The core of the medieval peasant winter diet was grain, bread, porridge, and pottage, a catch-all term for thick soup or stew that was more or less a permanent fixture over most medieval hearths. Pottage was the great sustainer, a thick, calorie-dense mixture of grains, legumes, root vegetables, and whatever else was available, cooked long and slow over the fire until it became a heavy, filling mass that sat in the stomach and provided a slow, steady metabolic burn for hours. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't varied. Most peasants ate essentially the same pottage repeatedly throughout the week, with minor variations depending on what was in the vegetable stores and whether anything interesting had happened on the farm recently. The grains that formed the backbone of winter eating were primarily barley, oats, and rye. Wheat was more valuable and often sold rather than eaten by poorer peasants who grew it. Barley and oats could be turned into porridge or added to pottage, and they were calorie-dense in the way that matters most in cold weather, slow to digest, providing sustained energy output. Rye flour made dark, dense bread that was heavy but filling and kept better than wheat bread in cold storage. Peasants who had good rye stores going into winter were in a better position than those who didn't. Root vegetables were the critical winter stores. Turnips, parsnips, and later carrots stored reasonably well in cool, dry conditions, either in an earthen cellar or buried in straw. Onions, preserved from the summer harvest, added flavor and some nutritional value to pottage. Dried peas and beans, legumes of various kinds, provided protein and worked exceptionally well in slow-cooked dishes. These were not glamorous foods. No medieval peasant was looking forward to another dinner of turnip and barley pottage. But they were calorie-dense, they were storable, and they kept people functional through the coldest months. Meat was a more complicated matter. Peasants weren't vegetarian by philosophy, but they were frequently vegetarian by economics. Meat, especially red meat, required either owning animals that you could afford to slaughter or having access to hunting rights that most peasants didn't have. The Great Autumn Slaughter, typically in November, was one of the most important events of the agricultural year. Animals that couldn't be fed through the winter were killed, and their meat was preserved by salting, smoking, or simply keeping it cold, which winter reliably provided. This salted and smoked meat was then rationed out through the winter months, a small addition to the pottage here and there, a meaningful source of fat and protein in a diet that could otherwise lack both. Fat was particularly prized in winter eating. Lard, rendered from the autumn slaughter, was an ingredient in cooking, a preservative for other foods, and in desperate times a direct caloric supplement. Animal fat provides more calories per gram than any other food type and metabolizes into heat efficiently. Medieval peasants who had access to good fat stores going into winter were materially better off than those who didn't, and they knew it. A pot of lard in the winter stores was worth considerably more than its weight in most other foods. The habit of eating a substantial meal before sleeping was both practical and culturally embedded. The digestion of a large meal generates genuine heat, the thermogenic effect of food, which is just metabolism running higher to process what you've eaten. In a context where additional body heat could be the difference between a comfortable night and a dangerous one, loading up on heavy food before bed was sound strategy. Medieval wisdom traditions around food, preserved in various forms in folk practice and monastic records, consistently emphasized the importance of a good supper in winter and the danger of going to bed hungry in cold weather. Ale was drunk frequently and in quantity that seems alarming to modern eyes, but there's important context. Medieval water quality was unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, and ale, being a fermented product, was microbiologically safer. It was also calorie-dense and provided a mild warming sensation, though the actual thermogenic effect of moderate alcohol is limited, and the thermoregulation impairing effects of larger quantities were probably not well understood. Still, a mug of ale before bed was pleasant and provided some calories, and peasants in the cold dark of winter took their pleasures where they could find them. Sleeping in shifts, the night watch. The idea of sleeping in shifts, two distinct periods of sleep separated by an hour or two of wakefulness in the middle of the night, was apparently common across medieval Europe, and is referenced in enough historical sources to have become a topic of genuine historical scholarship. Historians like Roger Eckertz have examined this pattern and found evidence that the modern expectation of a single continuous 8-hour sleep period may itself be an artifact of artificial lighting, which changed when and how humans slept after the Industrial Revolution. In a medieval household, the structure of the night was different. People went to bed when darkness fell or shortly after, which in winter meant early. They slept. Around midnight or 1 in the morning, many households entered a period of lighter sleep and wakefulness that could last an hour or more. People got up to check the fire. They used the privy. They talked quietly with household members who were also awake. In some records, this middle-of-the-night wakefulness is described as a natural and expected part of the night, rather than a problem to be solved. For winter survival, this natural break in sleep had an obvious practical application. Someone was awake in the middle of the night, at the coldest and darkest point, when the fire was most likely to have burned dangerously low, and when the temperature inside the house was at its nadir. That person, whoever was naturally waking during the first sleep interval, would tend to the fire, add wood or peat to bring it back up, check on any sick or very young members of the household, and verify that the animals were settled. Then they could go back to sleep for the second sleep period before morning. This was not experienced as a burden in the same way that a forced wake-up in the night might feel to a modern person accustomed to continuous sleep. It was simply the shape of the night, the natural rhythm of winter existence. Children old enough to be responsible were assigned their own fire-watching duties in rotation. Grandparents who slept lightly, as older adults tend to, were often the most reliable middle-of-the-night fire attendants, turning a product of aging into a survival asset. The consequences of failing to maintain the fire through the night ranged from miserable to fatal. A fire that went out in the early hours of a winter night meant a household waking to a temperature that might have dropped below freezing inside the room. Reigniting a fire from cold in those conditions, with frozen fingers and the flint and steel system that was the only available ignition method, could take 20 minutes to half an hour of increasingly desperate effort, during which time the cold was advancing unchecked and any hope of comfort was retreating rapidly. Better, far better, to never let it go out. Breathing like your life depends on it. This is one of the more counterintuitive survival strategies of the medieval winter, and it speaks to the level of physiological sophistication that people could develop through pure experience and observation, even without formal medical training. Medieval peasants, and the folk wisdom traditions they inherited, understood that cold air breathed directly into the lungs was dangerous in winter. They developed behavioral modifications around breathing that modern medicine would recognize as functionally valid. The practice was simple in principle, though requiring some discipline to maintain while half asleep. Breathe through the nose, not the mouth. Keep the breath shallow. Avoid panting or gasping in the cold. These weren't medically articulated rules. They were folk knowledge, passed from parent to child, reinforced by the visible consequences when they weren't followed. The nasal passages are, in fact, designed to warm and humidify incoming air before it reaches the lungs. Air breath through the nose arrives at the lower respiratory tract significantly warmer and more humidified than air breath through the open mouth, which routes it directly to the sensitive tissues of the throat and lungs with minimal conditioning. In extreme cold, The difference between nasal breathing and mouth breathing can affect how much cold air stress the respiratory system experiences. For people sleeping in cold conditions, the instinct is often to burrow under whatever covering is available and breathe from a small pocket of relatively warmer, already exhaled air. Medieval peasants did this too, drawing their cloaks or blankets up over their noses and mouths while sleeping, so that the air they breathed was pre-warmed by the fabric and by their own previous exhalations. This reduced the thermal shock to the lungs and also added some humidity to the air, which reduced the drying effect that cold, dry air has on respiratory membranes. Children were taught these practices early because they were more physiologically vulnerable to cold air, and because the respiratory diseases that killed so many medieval children in winter, pneumonia and its predecessors, were understood even without germ theory to be associated with cold and damp. You didn't need to know about bacteria to observe that children who got wet and cold in winter were more likely to get sick and die. The conclusion, keep them dry and warm and teach them to breathe carefully, was empirically correct even without the underlying science. The hot stone and the haybox. Ingenuity in service of warmth produced some genuinely clever solutions in medieval peasant households, and the heated stone is among the most elegant. The principle was almost too simple. Rocks retain heat. A rock heated in or near a fire accumulates thermal energy and releases it slowly over several hours as it cools. This is the same physics that makes stone buildings warmer in cold weather than wooden ones, the thermal mass effect, applied at the household scale. The process was straightforward. In the hours before bed, a flat stone, ideally dense and smooth, was placed near or directly in the hearth. It needed to be near but not in the hottest part of the fire, and it needed to be a type of stone that could handle the thermal stress without cracking, which was a learned skill because some common stones, particularly flint and certain wet stones, could fracture explosively when heated. Experienced peasants knew which local stones were safe and sought them out. After the stone had absorbed heat for an hour or two, it was removed carefully using sticks or tongs made for the purpose, wrapped in layers of cloth or tucked inside a clay pot, and placed in the bedding at foot level. There it radiated warmth through the night, slowly cooling but providing gentle heat for hours. A large, well-heated stone could remain comfortably warm for 5 or 6 hours. Small children placed at the foot of the family sleeping arrangement, near the stone but not in contact with it directly, benefited most. The wrapping was critical. An unwrapped stone, directly against skin or directly on straw, was a burn waiting to happen. The cloth wrapping acted as a buffer, reducing the surface temperature to something manageable while still allowing the heat to radiate outward. Over time, families accumulated specific cloths and small bags dedicated to this purpose, stained and marked by years of use. The haybox, a cousin of this technique, extended the warmth of cooked food rather than of stones. A well-insulated box, lined with dry hay or wool, would maintain the temperature of a hot cooking pot for many hours after it was removed from the fire. A pot of pottage placed in the haybox at dinner time could be retrieved still hot, or at least warm, at midnight or in the early morning hours. This meant that a family could have a warm meal without relighting or stoking the fire, saving fuel and keeping the cook from having to rebuild the fire in the dark. It's a simple idea. It works on the same principle as a modern thermos, thermal insulation slowing heat transfer, and it was genuinely useful in a context where hot food at unexpected hours was both a comfort and a caloric and metabolic benefit. A warm meal in the middle of a freezing night, even a modest one, provided both physical warmth from the eating and the psychological warmth of normalcy, of comfort, that could make a difficult night marginally more survivable. The community that kept you alive. No medieval peasant survived winter alone. This was not a philosophical statement. It was a structural reality of how medieval rural society was organized. Villages were cooperative units of survival, and winter was when the cooperation mattered most. The village community was knit together by shared resources, shared labor, shared dependency. Every family in the village knew every other family's situation to a degree that modern urban societies would find startling. Who had a good grain harvest and who had a poor one? Who had lost livestock to disease in the autumn? Whose elderly grandmother was ailing and needed more firewood than the family could gather alone? Whose children had taken ill? These things were known because the community was small, close, and fundamentally dependent on mutual awareness for its functioning. When families ran out of firewood in the deep of winter, it was normal for neighbors to share. Not without social consequence, not without the implicit understanding that the debt would be repaid in kind when circumstances reversed, but share they did, because the alternative was letting a neighbor die, and then knowing you hadn't stopped it when you could have. Medieval communities had plenty of interpersonal conflict, pettiness, grudge-holding, and unresolved disputes, but they also had a bedrock understanding that some things superseded the pettiness. Letting someone freeze to death over a disagreement about a boundary stone was not considered acceptable behavior. You helped. You negotiated the grudge separately later. Communal grain stores, maintained in some villages and managed by the village collectively, provided a buffer against the worst outcomes of a poor individual harvest. Families who had surplus contributed. Families who needed drew from it, with the expectation of future repayment. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was mutual insurance, an understanding that the wheel of fortune turned and that today's provider might be tomorrow's recipient. The system wasn't always fair, wasn't always functional, and was frequently manipulated by those with more social power. But in its basic form, it was one of the most important survival mechanisms available to medieval rural communities. The blacksmith, the miller, the village priest, these were more than service providers. They were nodes in the community network, people whose skills or positions gave them unusual visibility into the state of the village and unusual ability to respond. The priest, in particular, often served as a first responder to families in crisis, both because his theological role made him aware of deaths and serious illness, and because his connections across the whole community meant he could direct resources and labor toward those who needed them most urgently. Children were integrated into the community's winter survival network from the earliest age they could be useful. Young children carried wood. Slightly older ones ran messages. Teenagers helped elderly neighbors with physically demanding winter tasks, clearing snow, fetching water, carrying food. This was not sentimentality. It was a rational allocation of labor within a community that couldn't afford to have any capable pair of hands idle when there was survival work to be done. Faith as insulation. It would be a mistake to discuss medieval peasant winter survival without discussing faith, because faith was not merely an emotional comfort in this world. It was a structural element of daily life as real and present as the fire and the straw bed. In a world where so much was beyond human control, where winter was a genuine existential threat, where the margin between survival and death was so thin and so dependent on factors entirely outside your ability to manage, having a framework of meaning and hope was not a luxury. It was a necessity. The medieval peasant's world was densely populated with spiritual forces. Saints were not distant historical figures but active, present helpers who could be called upon specifically and practically. There were saints for protection against disease, saints for protection of livestock, saints for protection of children, saints for fire and for hearth, saints for stormy weather and for safe passage through the dark. These saints were addressed in prayers that were as specific and practical as a shopping list. The theological sophistication varied widely by household and by individual, but the basic sense of living in a world where spiritual forces were engaged on your behalf and could be appealed to directly was universal. The church calendar shaped the winter months, breaking the monotony of the cold season with feast days that were occasions for community gathering, slightly better food, and the psychological lift of celebration. Christmas itself, arriving at the darkest point of the year, was not yet the elaborate domestic festival it would become in later centuries, but it was an occasion for community celebration, for special food and drink if they could be obtained, and for the collective affirmation that the worst of the darkness was now passing and the light would return. Prayers at bedtime were not perfunctory. They were earnest and specific. You prayed for the fire to hold through the night. You prayed for the roof not to let in the storm that was building in the west. You prayed for the children to wake up healthy in the morning. You prayed for the livestock to survive and for the grain stores to be enough and for spring to come before the last barrel of salted pork ran out. These were not abstract spiritual aspirations. They were direct, practical requests to a spiritual system that the peasant genuinely believed could hear and respond to them. Superstitions and folk practices wrapped themselves around the edges of formal church teaching in ways that the church found troubling but proved unable to fully suppress. A particular arrangement of objects near the hearth would protect the fire. Certain words said in a certain way before sleep would guard against cold-related illness. A charm hung near the door would keep out evil forces, which in practical terms often meant the cold itself, conceptualized as having a malevolent agency. These were not seen as contradictions of Christian faith, but as natural extensions of it, the spiritual resources available to ordinary people to supplement official prayer with something more local, more specific, more immediately applicable. Candles, especially blessed candles from the church, were used at night not only for light but for their spiritual protective function. A flame, after all, was warmth and light and life, and a blessed flame was all of that plus spiritual protection. Keeping a blessed candle burning through the night was an expense in terms of precious candle material, but many families considered it worthwhile in the worst of winter. When winter won, all of this adaptation, all of this ingenuity and community and faith was not always enough. Medieval winters killed. They killed with terrible regularity, and they killed in ways that the survivors could not prevent and could barely mitigate. Understanding the full picture of medieval winter survival means also understanding when and why it failed. Young children were the most vulnerable. Their bodies were small, with a high surface area to volume ratio that meant they lost heat faster than adults. Their thermoregulatory systems were less mature. They couldn't generate heat as efficiently through shivering or through voluntary activity. And they couldn't advocate for themselves when they were cold, couldn't find their own warmth, couldn't make choices that adults could make. Medieval infant and child mortality rates in winter were significantly higher than in warmer seasons, and cold was a major direct and contributing factor. The very old were vulnerable in different ways. Their circulation was slower, making their extremities more susceptible to dangerous cold. Their metabolic rate was lower, meaning they generated less internal heat. Their immune systems were less robust, making them more susceptible to the respiratory infections that winter conditions promoted. And in a family unit where resources were finite, an elderly person who could no longer contribute labor was also in a more precarious position when the question of resource allocation arose. Medieval families generally maintained their elderly members with care and commitment, but when resources were genuinely exhausted, the young and the productive were prioritized. Frostbite was a winter reality that claimed portions of people rather than whole lives. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were the most common sights. The initial stages of frostbite, painful but reversible, were almost certainly common experiences for anyone who spent extended time in the cold with inadequate protection. The later stages, where tissue began to die and darken, were less common but far from rare. Medieval medical knowledge of how to treat frostbite was limited and sometimes actively harmful, involving the application of heat that could cause additional damage to already injured tissue. Limb amputations resulting from severe frostbite occurred and left their mark in both medical records, and in the physical evidence of skeletal remains that archaeologists have examined. The winters that history records as exceptional, the ones severe enough to leave a mark in chronicles and records, were genuinely catastrophic. The winter of 1317, part of the terrible Great Famine period, saw temperatures so extreme and prolonged that rivers froze solid for months. The harvest failure that preceded this winter meant that peasants entered it already in a weakened state with depleted stores. Mortality was staggering. Villages that entered the winter at full population emerged in spring, having lost 20, 30, 40% of their members in some of the worst affected regions. What strikes the modern reader about these catastrophes is the matter-of-fact way in which contemporary accounts describe them. Death at scale in winter was not an unimaginable horror to medieval people. It was a possibility they planned for, psychologically as well as practically. Every family that had lived through several winters had lost someone. Every village had its cluster of graves from the previous winter, the small mounds that accumulated in the churchyard between October and April at a rate that slowed but never entirely stopped in the warmer months. This normalized relationship with death by winter was not callousness. It was adaptive. In a world where you couldn't prevent it completely, making peace with its existence was a survival strategy of a different kind, a psychological one. Grief was real and genuine, but it could not incapacitate you, because there was always more wood to gather, more fire to bank, more children to warm, more work to do to push the margins of survival a little further in your favor. The legacy in cold stone. Looking back at the sum of what medieval peasants achieved against winter, what stands out is not any single technique or trick, but the cumulative intelligence of generations of people paying close attention to what kept them alive and teaching it to their children. Every piece of moss pressed into a wall crack was the product of someone having discovered that moss was a better insulator than bare air. Every banked fire represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to maintain combustion at the minimum sustainable level through a long, cold night. Every straw mattress, every shifted layering system, every pre-dawn fire check represented a human being taking their situation seriously, refusing to be passive in the face of it, and doing the specific practical work required to make it through to morning. This was not glamorous. No chronicler wrote ballads about the peasant who successfully banked his fire for the 15th consecutive winter, or the family that made it to March with all their children's toes intact. History prefers kings and battles, arrivals and departures, dramatic moments. It does not naturally preserve the patient, grinding, repetitive work of staying alive in the cold, season after season, generation after generation, which is one reason why the full picture of what medieval peasants achieved in winter is only now, centuries later, beginning to be understood and appreciated. But the evidence is there in the archaeological record, in the physical layout of medieval villages, which consistently show evidence of communal organization around shared resources, in the tools and techniques that survived long enough to be recorded by later writers, in the structural characteristics of medieval buildings in cold climates, which show clear evidence of deliberate choices made to maximize heat retention, in the dietary patterns visible in bone chemistry and surviving food records, which show that winter diets were systematically higher in calorie-dense staples. Medieval peasants survived the winter because they were serious about it, because they paid attention, because they accumulated and transmitted knowledge with the care of people who understood that knowledge was the difference between living and dying. Their solutions were specific to their world and their resources, but the underlying intelligence, practical, empirical, communal, is as recognizable today as it was then. The next time a cold night settles in and you reach for a blanket, you're doing something that has human roots as deep as civilization itself, warming yourself, surviving the dark, waiting for morning. Part 2, Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed everything. There is a kind of woman who enters a room and shifts something in it, not by trying to, not through any performance, just through the force of what she is. Anne Boleyn was that woman. And in the early 16th century, when most women in England were expected to be quiet, decorative, and accommodating, being that woman in the court of Henry VIII was one of the most dangerous things in the world. Anne wasn't born powerful. She was born into a family that was climbing, ambitious, well-connected, but not quite at the summit. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a diplomat of considerable skill and relentless social ambition. Her mother was from the Howard family, one of the great noble houses of England. Anne came into the world around 1501, possibly at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, though historians continue to debate the exact location and even the exact year. What's certain is that she arrived into a world of courtly striving and was shaped by it from the beginning. What separated Anne from the crowd of other daughters of ambitious minor nobles wasn't her birth. It was where she went next and what she became while she was there. The education of a queen in waiting. Most English girls of noble families in the early 16th century were educated at home or in a nearby great household, learning the domestic arts considered appropriate to their station: music, embroidery, household management, a little French, modest piety. They were being prepared, essentially, to become good wives and competent household managers. The education served those ends and nothing beyond them. Anne's education was not that. At around 12 years old, she was sent abroad, first to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands. Margaret was one of the most formidable women of the age, a regent governing on behalf of the Habsburg dynasty, a politician, a patron of the arts, a woman who exercised real power in a world that officially belonged to men and did so with such skill that even her political opponents had to admit her competence. Growing up in Margaret's household meant being surrounded daily by a model of female authority and capability that most English girls never encountered. Anne impressed Margaret enough that the Archduchess wrote to Thomas Boleyn expressing her admiration for the young girl's promise, a remarkable early notice of a talent that would eventually reshape a kingdom. From the Netherlands, Anne moved to France, to the court of Queen Claude and later to that of Marguerite of Navarre. If Margaret of Austria had taught Anne that women could govern, the French courts taught her everything else. French court culture in the early 16th century was the most sophisticated in Europe. It was a world of elaborate ceremonial, of wit deployed as a weapon, of conversation as an art form, of fashion and music and poetry as expressions of identity and power. It was a world where intelligence was not merely tolerated in women, but was actively valued, where learned women like Marguerite herself were celebrated rather than regarded with suspicion. Anne spent years in this environment, learning French so fluently that she later in England was sometimes described as speaking it like a native. She absorbed the aesthetic sensibility of the French court, its love of bold colors, dramatic jewelry, sophisticated tailoring. She developed a musical ability that was noticed and admired. She learned to dance at a standard that made her exceptional even in a court where dancing was a serious accomplishment. And she learned, perhaps most crucially, the complex social art of managing attention, of deploying wit and intelligence in social settings, of making people want to be near you without making the mechanism of that attraction obvious. When Anne returned to England in the early 1520s, she came home as something that the English court had essentially never encountered before, a young Englishwoman with the social education and cultural sophistication of a French courtier. She was instantly different from the women around her, not in a way that was easy to articulate, but in a way that was impossible to miss. The court and the king. The English court of Henry VIII in the early 1520s was a place of intense social competition and rigid hierarchy. At the top was the king, 30 years old, physically imposing, intellectually vain, and accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Henry had been on the throne since 1509 and had spent 13 years having his every whim accommodated. He was charming when he chose to be, which was often. He was dangerous when crossed, which was becoming more apparent as his reign went on. Queen Catherine of Aragon, his Spanish wife, was by the early 1520s approaching 40 and had failed to provide Henry with the male heir he desperately wanted. She had suffered multiple pregnancies, most ending in stillbirth or early infant death. Only one child had survived, Mary, born in 1516, healthy and intelligent but female. In a dynasty as new and as precariously established as the Tudors, a daughter was not the solution to the succession question. Henry needed a son, and Catherine, despite her own suffering and her quiet dignity in an increasingly difficult position, seemed unable to give him one. Into this charged environment arrived Anne Boleyn, 20-something, French-educated, sharp-tongued, and resolutely unwilling to behave like anyone's idea of a suitable object of court flirtation. She was appointed as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine, which put her at the center of court life while placing her technically in service of the woman whose crown she would eventually displace. The irony was not lost on later historians. Henry noticed Anne almost immediately. The court of the 1520s was full of attractive young women eager for royal attention, and Henry had conducted affairs with several of them, including Anne's own sister Mary. His approach to women was that of a man who had never been refused anything significant and who saw desirable women as a category of royal perquisite, like fine wine or good horses, something to be enjoyed and then moved on from. Anne did not cooperate with this model. When Henry signaled his interest, she did not respond with the flattered capitulation he had come to expect. She demurred, deflected, kept herself at a social distance that was friendly enough not to be outright rude but clearly insufficient from Henry's perspective. She laughed at his more extravagant compliments instead of accepting them. She engaged him in intellectual sparring instead of flattery. She was, in short, not the slightest bit intimidated by him, and Henry, whose entire life had been organized around the premise that he was the most impressive person in any room, found this absolutely fascinating. The man who had always been the hunter discovered that he was being hunted. The woman doing the hunting was not offering what he expected. Anne made it clear, through a combination of words and silences, of presence and careful absence, that she was not available to be a royal mistress. That category had been filled adequately by others and led nowhere that interested her. If Henry wanted Anne Boleyn, he would have to offer something unprecedented, a crown. This was either the most spectacular strategic gamble in Tudor history or a genuine expression of principle, and historians have argued about which for 5 centuries without reaching consensus. Perhaps it was both. Anne was certainly ambitious and certainly intelligent enough to see where the gamble might lead. But she was also a woman who had seen the courts of Europe, and who understood that there was a category of woman who mattered in the world and a category who didn't, and that the first category was the one she intended to occupy. The Great Matter. What followed has been called the King's Great Matter in historical shorthand, and the bland diplomatic language does no justice at all to what it actually was. One man's obsessive desire for one specific woman combined with a dynasty's need for a male heir, combined with a constitutional crisis that would ultimately shatter England's relationship with Rome and reshape the religious landscape of Europe. All because Anne Boleyn said no. Henry began his campaign for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine in 1527, nearly 6 years after he first became interested in Anne. Those 6 years had been a slow escalation of his determination and Anne's willingness to stay close enough to keep him engaged without giving him what he wanted before she was ready. They had exchanged letters, some of which survive, that show Henry in an increasingly urgent emotional state, writing of his love with an intensity that was not merely performative, and Anne in a careful, measured position that kept him hungry. The annulment case hinged on a theological argument. Henry had been granted a special papal dispensation to marry Catherine, his brother Arthur's widow, because church law normally prohibited such marriages. Henry's new position, pressed by his theological advisers and accepted with remarkable speed by a king very willing to be convinced, was that the dispensation had been improper and the marriage therefore invalid from the start. He was not seeking a divorce. He was insisting the marriage had never legally existed, and that his 20-year union with Catherine was a void in the eyes of God. Catherine refused this framing absolutely, and with a dignity that commanded wide respect even from people who wished she would simply comply and disappear. She maintained consistently that her marriage to Arthur had never been properly consummated, making the impediment moot, and that she was Henry's legitimate wife and queen. She appealed to Rome, and Rome, under enormous pressure from Catherine's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who had significant military leverage over the papacy at this particular moment in history, found itself unable to rule in Henry's favor. The impasse lasted years. Henry petitioned, threatened, cajoled. Rome delayed, studied, prevaricated. Catherine prayed and wrote letters and refused to accept a reduction of her status. Anne remained at court, growing in influence and in the hatred of those who blamed her for the disruption of English political life. The people of London, who were fond of Catherine in the uncomplicated way that populations tend to be fond of dignified wronged queens, were considerably less fond of Anne. When her barge passed on the Thames, crowds sometimes jeered. When she appeared at court functions, the mood was not always welcoming. She was called the king's whore, she was called a witch. She was blamed for things she had no control over and for things she had engineered. She was not universally beloved, and she knew it. But she had the king, and in the court of Henry VIII, having the king was the only power that mattered. The crown. The situation resolved, or rather exploded, in 1532 and 1533, when Henry, tired of waiting for Rome and increasingly influenced by reformist advisers who saw in his annulment crisis an opportunity to redirect England's church away from papal authority entirely, began to move unilaterally. Thomas Cranmer was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, a man whose sympathies lay with reform and who was willing to serve the king's purposes. Parliament, under the direction of Thomas Cromwell, passed a series of acts that methodically severed England's formal legal and financial ties to Rome. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, passed in 1533, declared England an empire, meaning a self-sufficient jurisdiction with no superior authority outside its own borders, which was the legal mechanism that allowed an English court to rule on English marriage cases without reference to Rome. Cranmer convened an ecclesiastical court, and in May 1533 formally declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void. Shortly after, he declared Henry's secret marriage to Anne, which had taken place quietly in January 1533 when Anne was already pregnant, to be valid. Anne was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey on June 1, 1533. The coronation was magnificent in its ceremonial, with all the traditional elements faithfully reproduced, the anointing with sacred oil, the crown placed on her head, the scepter and orb in her hands. But it was not universally celebrated. The crowds in London were less exuberant than at previous coronations. Some refused to remove their hats when her procession passed. Observers noted an atmosphere that was respectful in form, but noticeably cool in content. Anne entered her queenship in a uniquely precarious position. She had achieved what no previous English woman in her circumstances had achieved, the transformation from a royal interest into a royal wife. But she had made enemies in the process. Catherine's supporters who had not forgiven her, members of the old nobility who resented the Boleyn family's rise, religious traditionalists horrified at the break with Rome, and ordinary English people who felt a deep, uncomplicated loyalty to Catherine and found Anne difficult to warm to. What Anne had going for her was the king's love, the pregnancy that might produce the longed-for heir, and an intelligence that she had already demonstrated could navigate extraordinarily complex situations successfully. These were not inconsiderable assets, but they were all contingent on Henry, and Henry was a variable that no one in his court had ever been able to reliably predict. The Queen's shadow. September 1533 brought the first blow. Anne gave birth to a daughter. The child was healthy, clearly intelligent, and would grow up to be one of the greatest monarchs England ever produced. But in September 1533 she was a disappointment. Henry had wanted a son. The astrologers had predicted a son. The physicians had analyzed the signs and declared the child would be a son. Anne herself was certain she was carrying a son. When the girl arrived and was named Elizabeth, Henry's response was subdued. Anne, who had the emotional intelligence to read situations with precision, knew what this meant. She had one chance to correct the impression: another pregnancy, a boy, as quickly as possible. She also understood, with the clear-eyed realism that had served her so well throughout her ascent, that her position at court was not unconditional. It rested on Henry's continued affection and on her continued usefulness to his dynastic needs. Lose either, and everything else became negotiable in ways that were potentially catastrophic. In the years of her queenship, Anne moved to consolidate her position in every way available to her. She used her influence over patronage, the ability to support careers and advance allies, to build a network of loyal supporters across church and court. She engaged in the theological and political debates of the Reformation with genuine intellectual substance, supporting the distribution of English-language Bibles, patronizing reformist preachers, and pushing for a version of English religious reform that went further than the purely political and financial break with Rome that Henry had so far implemented. She was also, by most accounts, a difficult person to serve under. Her standards were high. Her tongue was sharp. She had a temper that she didn't always bother to control, and her position had given her the power to express displeasure in ways that had real consequences for the people on the receiving end. Those who served her were often devoted to her, but those who crossed her rarely forgot it. She made enemies in the personal sphere as readily as in the political one. The subsequent pregnancies brought continued heartbreak. Miscarriages followed the birth of Elizabeth, each one reducing Anne's stock in Henry's eyes and in the eyes of the court that was always watching for which direction the wind was blowing. By 1535, it was becoming apparent to acute observers that Henry's attention was wandering, specifically in the direction of Jane Seymour, a young woman from Wiltshire of gentle temperament and strategic patience, whose family had positioned her with quiet calculation. Where Anne was fire, Jane was water. Where Anne challenged, Jane acquiesced. Where Anne's wit cut, Jane's manner soothed. Henry, who had spent years enchanted by difficulty and had now spent years living with it, was finding the charms of ease increasingly attractive. Anne saw it. She responded with the intensity that was characteristic of everything she did, trying to reclaim Henry's attention, confronting Jane, confronting Henry, refusing to pretend what was happening wasn't happening. This was both her greatest quality and her most dangerous characteristic. Anne didn't perform. She felt things fully and expressed them. In a court where performance was survival, this was a vulnerability that her enemies were preparing to exploit. The betrayal. Thomas Cromwell is one of the most interesting figures in early Tudor history. A man of common birth who rose to the highest administrative office in England through sheer competence. A man who had worked alongside Anne Boleyn in advancing the Reformation agenda, and who now, in 1536, had decided that she was more liability than asset, and that removing her was his best path to continued royal favor. Cromwell and Anne had been allies, then rivals, and by 1536 were effectively enemies. Their falling out had multiple dimensions: policy differences over how Reformation revenues should be used, personal friction, and most fundamentally the recognition on Cromwell's part that Henry's patience with Anne was running out, and that attaching yourself too closely to a falling star was a career-ending and potentially life-ending mistake. Cromwell's solution was breathtaking in its ruthlessness. He would not arrange Anne's removal through a divorce or an annulment. Divorce would raise too many uncomfortable parallels to the Catherine situation. Instead, he would manufacture a criminal case against her. The charges: adultery, incest, and conspiring against the king's life. The evidence: primarily coerced confessions, interpretations of normal courtly behavior twisted into something sinister, and the testimony of people who had their own reasons to please Cromwell and the king. The charges were almost certainly false. The level of logistics required for Anne to have conducted multiple simultaneous affairs under the conditions of close observation that surrounded a Tudor queen makes the accusations implausible on their face. The incest charge, alleging that Anne had an intimate relationship with her brother George Boleyn, a man described by those who knew him as charming and talented, was so extreme and so convenient in its political usefulness that historians have overwhelmingly regarded it as fabricated. But fabricated charges, in a system where the king's displeasure was the most powerful force in the kingdom, and where the judges trying the case were themselves court figures dependent on royal favor, were perfectly capable of producing conviction. The law in such circumstances was less a neutral framework than an instrument of political will. Cromwell built his case with care over several months, gathering statements, identifying vulnerable witnesses who could be pressured into compliance, and constructing a narrative that gave Henry a morally acceptable exit from a marriage he now found burdensome. It was efficient work in a grim cause. By April 1536, the machinery was in motion. Anne was arrested on the 29th of April. She was taken to the Tower of London, the fortress on the Thames that served as both royal palace and state prison, arriving by barge on a spring day that observers noted with the slight unreality of a dream. The same tower in which she had spent the night before her coronation less than 3 years earlier. Then, she had been going to be crowned. Now, the river carried her toward something quite different. The trial. The trial of Anne Boleyn and the men accused of adultery with her took place in May 1536. The accused men included her brother George Boleyn, a musician named Mark Smeaton who had reportedly confessed under torture, and several courtiers whose primary offense appears to have been proximity to a queen whom someone in power wanted to destroy. George Boleyn's wife, Jane Parker, provided testimony that contributed to the case against both her husband and his sister. Her motivations remain debated by historians. Fear, coercion, personal animosity toward George, or some combination of all three have been proposed. Whatever her reasons, her testimony was politically devastating and personally fatal to her husband. Anne's trial was conducted before a panel of noble judges in the Great Hall of the Tower. The charges were read. The evidence was presented. The men accused alongside her had already been found guilty and sentenced to death. The outcome in this context was not genuinely in doubt. Anne conducted her defense with a composure that contemporaries found remarkable. Her responses to the charges were specific, logical, and impossible to counter with direct factual evidence, because there wasn't any. She denied everything. She pointed out inconsistencies and impossibilities in the prosecution's timeline. She maintained, with complete consistency, that she had been faithful to the king and loyal in her duties as queen. It made no difference. The jurors, who included among them Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, returned a guilty verdict. The Duke, reportedly weeping, pronounced the sentence. Anne would be executed, either beheaded or burned at the king's pleasure. Henry, in this instance, chose beheading, which was considered a more merciful death, and was the usual sentence for women of rank. Anne received the verdict with what onlookers described as an almost unnatural calm. She asked for mercy on her soul and expressed her wish that the king's reign be long and prosperous. She said nothing that could be used against anyone else, named no accomplices, made no dramatic accusations. She was, to the end, controlling what she could control. The men accused alongside her, including her brother George, were executed on May 17th. Anne was informed that her own execution would follow shortly, originally on the 18th, but delayed by 1 day. The delay seems to have been administrative rather than a sign of any wavering in the decision. The final days. Anne spent her last days in the Tower in a state that surprised her guards. She ate well. She slept. She prayed with great intensity and duration. She talked with the women attending her, sometimes with apparent calm and sometimes with the nervous, rapid speech of someone whose mind was moving too fast. She made jokes about her impending death, specifically about the smallness of her neck and the efficiency with which the French swordsman appointed for the task would be able to address it. Her ladies wept. Anne wiped her eyes and composed herself. She received the last religious rites with genuine devotion. She made her confessions. She swore on the sacrament, the most serious oath available to a medieval Christian, that she was innocent of the charges against her. Whether one believes her or not, the gravity of the act was significant even in a context of political expediency. A woman who genuinely believed she was about to face God, and who had committed the crimes she was accused of, would have had powerful motivation to make a genuine confession, rather than dying with a false oath on her soul. Henry, meanwhile, was conducting a quiet courtship of Jane Seymour, and had arranged for their engagement to be formalized the day after Anne's execution. The speed of this transition, the execution on May 19th and the formal betrothal on the 20th, was noted at the time, and has been noted ever since as evidence of how thoroughly Henry had committed to this path before Anne had even come to trial. The morning of May 19th, 1536 arrived with the pale, undecided quality of an English spring morning. Anne dressed carefully, as she always had throughout her adult life, with an attention to appearance that was not vanity but an understanding of what appearance communicated. She chose a gray gown of damask trimmed with fur, with a scarlet petticoat. The choice of color was deliberate. Gray and crimson together carried associations of penitence and sacrifice that she was consciously invoking. She walked to the scaffold that had been built within the Tower walls, on the green inside rather than on Tower Hill, sparing her the public spectacle of a more exposed execution site. A small crowd of witnesses attended, court officials, dignitaries, a few others. She ascended the steps. The last words. Anne Boleyn's speech from the scaffold survives in multiple versions, and while the wording differs between accounts, the essential character is consistent. She did not rage. She did not accuse. She praised the king, because not to do so would have endangered others who might suffer reprisals for perceived disloyalty, and because she seems to have maintained some genuine complexity of feeling toward Henry even at this point. She asked for mercy for her soul and the souls of those who had condemned her. She said she was prepared to die. The French swordsman was skilled at his work. The execution was, by the standards available, swift. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded, her eyes raised, and it was over in a moment. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds, the bodies of executed nobility being buried there by custom. Her grave was unmarked. There was no formal funeral, no period of official mourning. The business of the court continued. 11 days later, Henry VII married Jane Seymour. The daughter She left. The ending that posterity has tended to emphasize is not the execution but what came after. Anne's daughter Elizabeth, who was 2 years and 8 months old when her mother was beheaded, who was declared illegitimate within days of the execution, who spent her childhood in a position of genuine dynastic uncertainty, survived. She survived the remaining years of Henry's reign. She survived the brief reigns of her half-brother Edward and her half-sister Mary. She waited. She was careful and patient and considerably more willing than her mother to perform the expected female behaviors when political survival required it. In 1558, Elizabeth Tudor became Queen of England. She reigned for 45 years, producing one of the most extraordinary expansions of English cultural, economic, and imperial power in history. The Elizabethan age, with its Shakespeare, its Spenser, its Drake and Raleigh, its flowering of English identity and ambition, was her creation. She never spoke publicly of her mother. It was not safe to do so. Anne's memory was officially tainted, officially disgraced, and Elizabeth had survived by keeping certain things carefully unsaid. But she kept portraits. She kept jewelry. She had inherited Anne's falcon badge, and there is evidence that she wore it. She had inherited Anne's dark eyes and Anne's sharp intelligence and Anne's refusal to be underestimated. Anne Boleyn set in motion a chain of events that produced Elizabeth I. The break with Rome that Anne's marriage necessitated produced the Church of England. The changes that flowed from that break shaped English and later British society for centuries in ways that still have not fully finished unfolding. By any measure of historical consequence, Anne Boleyn accomplished more than almost any woman of her age, and she accomplished it without an army, without inherited power, and ultimately without the protection of the man she had staked everything on. She was executed at 35 or so, and she outlasted everyone who killed her, not in years, but in weight. Part 3. The Boston Tea Party, Tea Tyranny, and the Birth of Revolution. Let's talk about tea. Specifically, let's talk about the night that approximately 342 chests of it went into Boston Harbor at the hands of men in badly applied disguises, and why that single act of deliberate, expensive vandalism became one of the foundational moments in the history of the United States of America. It sounds improbable stated plainly. A revolution touched off by tea, but the tea was never really the point. The tea was a symbol, and the men who dumped it into the harbor on the night of December 16, 1773, knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what it meant. They were making a statement that no pamphlet, no petition, no carefully worded letter to Parliament could have made with the same clarity. We will not be governed without our consent, not for any price. Not even for cheaper tea. A decade of grievances. To understand the Boston Tea Party, you have to understand the decade of rising fury that preceded it. This didn't begin in 1773. It began in 1765, when the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a direct tax on the American colonies applied to virtually every piece of printed material, newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, even playing cards. Every colony felt it. Every lawyer, printer, merchant, and card player in America understood immediately what it meant. Parliament had declared the right to tax the colonies directly, without the consent of any colonial assembly, and fully intended to exercise that right. The response in the colonies was immediate and furious. The phrase that crystallized the objection was already circulating in American political discourse, drawn from English constitutional tradition: no taxation without representation. The colonies had no representatives in Parliament. Parliament had no right to tax them. This was not a radical position, the colonists argued. It was the bedrock principle of English constitutional liberty, the same principle that had produced the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution. The colonies were not asking for independence. They were asking to be treated as Englishmen. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766 after colonial boycotts hammered British merchants hard enough to make Parliament reconsider. But the Declaratory Act, passed simultaneously with the repeal, stated explicitly that Parliament had the right to legislate for the colonies in all matters whatsoever. The colonists had won the battle and lost the argument, and everyone involved knew it. The Townshend Acts of 1767 pushed the wound open again. These applied import duties to a range of goods the colonies purchased from Britain: glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. Another round of boycotts followed, another period of mounting tension. Partial repeal came in 1770, when all the Townshend duties were removed except one: the tax on tea, which Parliament retained specifically to assert the principle that they retained the right. The right, that was always the central issue. The colonies were not impoverished by the tea tax in economic terms. The amount they paid was modest, but the tax's existence was a standing statement that Parliament's authority over them was unlimited and unconditional. Every time an American purchased taxed tea, they were, in the most literal possible sense, paying for their own subjugation. Many Americans simply stopped buying taxed tea. Smuggled Dutch tea flooded the colonial market, purchased by colonists who preferred Dutch suppliers on purely political grounds. By 1773, the East India Company's legally taxed tea was being outsold in America by smuggled tea, and the company was sitting on an enormous unsold inventory that was becoming a serious financial problem. The TACT, the trap disguised as a bargain. Parliament's response to the East India Company's problems was the Tea Act of 1773, and it was, in retrospect, one of the most politically miscalculated pieces of legislation in British imperial history. The act gave the East India Company the ability to sell tea directly to the American colonies, bypassing the colonial merchants who had previously served as intermediaries. By eliminating the middlemen, the company could undercut even the smuggled Dutch tea on price. Americans would get cheaper tea than they had ever had before. The company would clear its inventory. Everyone, theoretically, wins. Except that the hated tax remained in place. The tea would be cheaper, yes, but it would still be taxed by Parliament, still be a reminder every time you poured a cup that Parliament believed it owned you. And this was understood instantly by colonial political leaders who had been watching for exactly this kind of move, a temptation designed to get the colonists to accept a principle by making its immediate consequences pleasant. Samuel Adams, who was possibly the most skilled political organizer in the colonies at this point, and who had been building networks of resistance for years through his creation of the Committees of Correspondence, saw it immediately. Accepting the cheap tea was accepting Parliament's right to tax. Once accepted, that right would be exercised elsewhere in other ways with less benevolent framing. The principle mattered more than the price. Always the principle. Colonial merchants, particularly in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, had additional and more immediate concerns. The East India Company's direct sales model would destroy their business. These were real economic stakes alongside the political ones, and they added a layer of commercial fury to the ideological outrage. The merchants and the patriots were aligned against the Tea Act for overlapping but distinct reasons, and that alignment made the opposition more powerful and more organized than either group could have mounted alone. Boston sets its course. Boston in November 1773 was a city primed. It had the scars of the Stamp Act resistance, of the occupation by British troops that followed, of the Boston Massacre of 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd and killed 5 civilians. The men and women of Boston had been living in a state of barely managed tension with imperial authority for years. They knew how to organize. They had the networks, the meeting halls, the newspapers, and the committed activists that political mobilization requires. When the first of the tea ships, the Dartmouth, arrived in Boston Harbor on November 28, 1773, carrying 114 chests of East India Company tea, the stage was already being set. British law required that imported cargo be unloaded and the relevant duties paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. After that deadline, customs officials could seize the cargo by force. This created a hard countdown for the people of Boston, 20 days to find a solution, or the tea came ashore under British authority and the tax was paid, whether the colonists agreed or not. Governor Thomas Hutchinson held the other end of the problem. Hutchinson was not a stupid man. He was, in fact, a careful and intelligent administrator who understood the situation clearly. But he was a loyalist who believed firmly in parliamentary authority and who was politically unable to give the colonists what they needed to resolve the standoff peacefully, an order for the ships to leave with the tea still aboard. He tried to send the ships away, and when he did, British warships in the harbor under his authority made clear that no vessel was leaving without proper customs clearance. The harbor was, in effect, sealed. The Sons of Liberty organized a series of enormous public meetings at the Old South Meeting House, the largest gathering space in Boston. Thousands of people attended, packed together in the cold, their breath rising in clouds, their voices joining in resolutions of defiance. Speaker after speaker urged resistance. Night patrols were organized to prevent anyone from unloading the tea clandestinely. Riders were dispatched to keep the wider countryside informed of developments. The machinery of organized resistance, which had been built and maintained by Adams and his associates across years of steady work, was running at full capacity. The two other tea ships, the Aliner and the Beaver, arrived in early December, adding more tea to the problem and making the scale of the planned response clearer. By December 16th, the day of the meeting that would set events in motion, there were 342 chests of East India Company tea sitting in 3 ships in Boston Harbor, and the 20-day deadline for the first ship had arrived. December 16th, 1773. The meeting at the Old South Meeting House on December 16th was the largest yet. Estimates suggest between 5,000 and 7,000 people attended or gathered outside in the surrounding streets and open spaces. For a city of about 16,000, that represented an extraordinary mobilization of the population. The formal business of the meeting was one last attempt at a negotiated resolution. A message was sent to Governor Hutchinson asking him to allow the tea ships to leave. Hutchinson, at his country house outside the city, sent back a firm refusal. The ships would not depart. The law would be observed. The reply arrived at the meeting house as darkness was settling in over the city. Samuel Adams received it, waited a moment, and then spoke the words that signaled the end of debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. It was a signal, not a resignation. Those in the crowd who were in on the plan understood what it meant. In the moments that followed, shouts came from outside the hall, war whoops, the call that had been arranged in advance. Men began to move. In various locations around the city, in back rooms and warehouses and private homes, groups of men were preparing themselves with quiet, purposeful efficiency. They darkened their faces with soot and lamp black. They wrapped themselves in blankets and rough wool cloaks. Some added feathers to their hats in the loosest possible reference to Native American appearance. The disguise was not meant to fool anyone into thinking they were actually Mohawk warriors. It was meant to provide deniability, a thin legal fiction that the men under those disguises were not the respectable artisans and merchants and tradespeople of Boston who would need to continue going about their daily lives in the morning. They gathered at the wharf in groups, moving quietly through the December darkness. They were armed with axes and short-handled hatchets, tools for breaking open wooden chests. They were not armed for violence. The operation had been planned with military precision, and violence against persons was explicitly not part of the plan. The harbor, Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 ships were moored, lay along the Boston waterfront in the cold darkness of a December night. The harbor smelled of salt and tide. The ships sat quiet. British warships were anchored nearby in the harbor, and their presence was known, but no order came for them to intervene. The groups approached the ships with remarkable calmness. The few sailors and night watchmen aboard were informed, politely but firmly, that their presence was not required and that no harm was intended to them or to the ships. They should stand aside. Most did. There was no violence. Then the work began. The chests were in the holds, heavy wooden boxes banded with iron, each containing several hundred pounds of dried tea. Men descended into the holds, located the chests, and passed them up to the deck. There, others broke them open with the hatchers, each blow of the axe sending up a cloud of fragrant tea dust into the winter air. The broken chests and their contents were heaved over the rail into the harbor below. The sound of axes on wood, the splash of chests hitting water, the fragrance of tea carrying on the harbor wind. This was what the Boston Tea Party actually sounded like and smelled like. Not a riot, not a battle. A deliberate, methodical destruction of property conducted by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. They worked for approximately 3 hours. 342 chests were broken open and thrown into the harbor. The tea, most of it Bohea, Kungu, Singlo, Hyson, and Souchong varieties, much of it high quality, hit the water and spread in an expanding dark stain across the surface of the harbor. At some point, the tea piled up so thick along the shoreline that the men had to wade in and push it out with their hatchets to ensure it didn't simply pile up and be recoverable. One chest was broken into and a man was found with his pockets stuffed with tea, intending to take some home. He was identified, stripped of the tea, and sent off with a warning. Nothing was to be taken. Nothing was to be profited from. This was not theft. It was destruction with a purpose, and the line had to be held. When the last chest had gone over the side, the decks were swept clean. The hatches were closed. The ships were as clean as they had been found. The entire operation left the vessels themselves undamaged and untouched except for the absence of their cargo. The men dispersed into the Boston night, quickly and quietly, returning the way they had come, shedding their disguises, washing the soot from their faces. By morning, Boston was a city of innocent citizens who had all apparently been home in bed and had no idea who might have dumped all that tea into the harbor. The morning after, Boston woke the next morning to an unusual smell. The harbor reeked of tea, a curiously domestic scent overlaying the usual brine and fish smell of a working port. The tide had pushed the tea up along the shoreline in dense mats, and small boats could be seen pushing the leaves back away from the shore where they might have been scooped up. Men stood at the water's edge and looked at what had been done. Some said nothing. Some said everything had just changed. The news spread out from Boston with remarkable speed. The Committee of Correspondence Network, which connected Boston to political leaders across all 13 colonies, had writers ready and moving before the sun was fully up. Within days, accounts of the event were being read in parlors and taverns from New Hampshire to Georgia, printed in newspapers, and discussed in every political forum the colonies possessed. The reactions were complex and didn't fall along simple lines. Among committed patriots, there was a surge of something close to joy, the satisfaction of a response so direct and so uncompromising that it could not be misread. Benjamin Franklin, then still in London as a colonial representative, condemned the destruction of private property and argued that restitution should be offered, a position that put him at odds with many of his colonial allies. John Adams wrote in his diary that the destruction of the tea was magnificent, the boldest and most dignified act in the entire history of resistance against British authority. Samuel Adams publicly said nothing that directly connected him to the events. Privately, he was probably pleased. The British response was not long in arriving. The coercive acts, punishment that became fuel. Parliament's reaction to the Boston Tea Party was unanimous and furious. The members who had argued for restraint in previous conflicts were silent or converted. Even those who had been sympathetic to colonial grievances in previous debates could not defend the destruction of private property. The king was angry. The ministry was determined to act. The question was not whether to punish Boston, but how severely. The answer came in 4 acts passed in the spring of 1774, which became known collectively in Britain as the Coercive Acts and in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act was the first and most immediately devastating. It ordered Boston Harbor closed to all commercial traffic until the East India Company was compensated for the destroyed tea and the customs authorities were satisfied that order had been restored. The harbor was Boston's lifeblood. It was how the city fed itself, how it traded, how it functioned. Closing it was the economic equivalent of a siege. The Massachusetts Government Act struck at the colony's political structure. It effectively ended elected self-government in Massachusetts, replacing the elected council with a council appointed by the crown, restricting town meetings to one per year except with the governor's permission, and giving royal officials immunity from local prosecution. It was, the colonists argued, the conversion of a free English community into a military occupation. Two further acts completed the package, one allowing British officials accused of crimes in Massachusetts to be tried in Britain rather than in the colony, and one expanding the quartering of British troops in colonial buildings. Together, the four acts constituted a comprehensive attempt to break Massachusetts's will and serve as an example to the other colonies of what happened when you challenged Parliament. The calculation was straightforward. Make the punishment severe enough, make the example clear enough, and the other colonies would pull back from the edge. They would see the cost of resistance and choose compliance. The calculation was catastrophically wrong. Unity. The intolerable acts did not break Massachusetts. They bound it to every other colony in the continent through the most powerful of all political forces, shared outrage. The closing of Boston's harbor, the suppression of Massachusetts's self-government, the quartering of troops in civilian homes. Every one of these measures was understood by political leaders across the colonies not as a local problem, but as a warning about what any colony might face if it challenged parliamentary authority. If Boston could be treated this way, so could Philadelphia, so could New York, so could Virginia. The precedent being set in Massachusetts harbor was a precedent for every American harbor. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions of support for Massachusetts. Convoys of supplies, food, livestock, money made their way north to the besieged city from colonies as far south as the Carolinas. The symbolic and the practical merged. By sending help to Boston, the colonies were also making a statement about their unity. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, drawing delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. It was an unprecedented gathering, the first time the colonies had attempted anything like a unified political body, and it produced agreements on trade boycotts, resolutions of colonial rights, and most significantly an agreement that an attack on any colony would be regarded as an attack on all. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia still mostly described their goal as reconciliation, the restoration of the relationship with Britain as it had been before the taxation disputes. The word independence was rarely used in official documents at this stage. But beneath the cautious official language, the transformation was happening. Men who had arrived in Philadelphia as Virginians and Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers were leaving with a new and tentative sense of something larger. An American identity, fragile and incomplete but present, oriented around the shared experience of grievance and resistance. In the villages and farms and cities across the colonies, ordinary people were making choices about what they believed and what they were willing to do about it. Militia companies drilled on village greens. Weapons were quietly stockpiled. Women organized associations to produce homespun cloth to replace British imports. The political was becoming the personal, and the personal was increasingly becoming the military. The road to Lexington. The months between the First Continental Congress and the spring of 1775 were months of accumulating tension, of British authorities in Massachusetts trying to assert control and finding that control increasingly difficult to assert, of colonial militias preparing for something they couldn't precisely name, but were increasingly certain was coming. Governor Thomas Gage, who had replaced Hutchinson as Massachusetts royal governor, was a professional soldier who understood clearly enough that the situation was deteriorating. He tried to seize colonial weapon stores that he knew were being accumulated in the countryside. In September 1774, he successfully seized cannon and ammunition stored in Cambridge, an operation that caused near panic in the region but no armed resistance. The near miss emboldened him and alarmed the colonists. By April 1775, intelligence had reached Gage that a significant weapons cache was being maintained in Concord, a town about 20 miles west of Boston. He ordered a column of British regulars to march out and seize or destroy it. The operation was meant to be secret, but Boston's intelligence networks were considerably better than Gage's security. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode out on the night of April 18th to alert the countryside. Colonial militiamen mobilized with a speed that testified to months of preparation and training. The British column reached Lexington Common at dawn on April 19, 1775. A ragged line of perhaps 70 or 80 colonial militiamen stood on the green, significantly outnumbered by the British regulars, in a confrontation whose purpose was not entirely clear to anyone. The order was given to the militiamen to disperse. They were beginning, reluctantly, to do so when a shot was fired. No one has ever established definitively who fired it or why. The British regulars, perhaps startled, opened fire. 8 militiamen died on Lexington Green. The remainder scattered. The column marched on to Concord, destroyed some of the weapons stores, and then began the long march back to Boston, where they arrived battered and bloodied after being harassed the entire way by colonial militia firing from behind walls and trees and barns. By the end of April 19th, over 250 British soldiers and approximately 90 Americans were dead or wounded. The American Revolution had begun. The echo in the harbor. Draw the line back from Lexington and Concord, back through the First Continental Congress, back through the intolerable acts, back through the morning when Boston Harbor smelled of tea, and the reality of what had happened was just beginning to sink in. The thread is unbroken. The men who stood on Lexington Green in April 1775 were the political descendants of the men who had boarded those ships in December 1773. They had been radicalized by the same process, had moved through the same escalating confrontations, had arrived at the same understanding that the relationship between Britain and its American colonies had reached a point where negotiation was no longer producing results and where principle had to be defended in some other way. The Boston Tea Party was not the cause of the revolution. It was a symptom, a dramatically vivid and politically consequential expression of grievances that had been building for a decade. But it was also a catalyst, an act that changed the political chemistry on both sides of the Atlantic in ways that made certain subsequent outcomes more likely and certain alternatives less available. By choosing to destroy the tea rather than pay for it, the colonists chose a confrontation over a compromise. By responding with the coercive acts rather than with conciliation, Parliament chose a confrontation over a rethinking of imperial policy. Each side moved to a position that the other could not accept, and the space between them narrowed to nothing. From nothing, revolutions begin. The tea that floated in Boston Harbor on December 17, 1773, that dark, spreading stain on the surface of the cold water, was dissolving more than it knew. It was dissolving the last realistic possibility of a peaceful reconciliation between Britain and its American colonies. It was dissolving the fiction that colonial resistance could be managed by calibrated economic pressure. It was dissolving the assumption that the colonists, when it came down to it, would always prefer the practical benefits of the imperial relationship to the inconvenient costs of their principles. They wouldn't, they didn't, and the world that came out of that choice is, with all its complications and imperfections and ongoing arguments about what it means, the world we still inhabit today. Part 4, Caral, the city that remembered nothing and changed everything. Before the pyramids of Egypt were imagined, before Mesopotamian cities hummed with the noise of the world's first urban civilization, before any of the civilizations that fill our history textbooks had drawn their first breath, there was already a city. On the coast of what is now Peru, in a valley so dry and so remote that it barely registers on a map of hospitable terrain, human beings had already figured out how to build something extraordinary. Caral. The name means little to most people who encounter it. It appears in archaeology journals and UNESCO heritage lists, and occasionally in the margins of textbooks as a kind of footnote, an asterisk in the human story that says, "Hold on, we may have missed something." And what we missed is significant enough to require a fundamental rethinking of how we understand civilization, where it came from, how many times it independently occurred, and what it actually requires to exist. What we missed is one of the oldest cities in the world, not in the Americas, in the world. The valley that shouldn't work. The Soup Valley in coastal Peru is not, on first impression, a place you would choose to build a civilization. The landscape is desert, not the dramatic sand dune desert of the Sahara, but the gray-brown, wind-scored coastal desert of the Pacific Rim, where the Humboldt Current keeps the air cold and the coast perpetually overcast and the rainfall essentially non-existent. The river that runs through the valley, the Soup River, is modest, seasonal in parts, and has none of the grand agricultural abundance of the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates. And yet, the people who arrived in the Soup Valley sometime around 3000 BCE found in this unpromising landscape something that their vision and their knowledge of the land could transform. The river, though modest, was real. Where it flowed, things could grow if the water was managed correctly. The nearby ocean, less than 20 kilometers away, was rich with marine life that could serve as a reliable protein source without deploying the energy of cultivation. The mountains behind the valley provided stone, and the valley floor provided earth, and between these two resources, a city could be built. The people of what we now call Caral understood this, and they built accordingly. What makes Caral remarkable is not just its age, but the sophistication and completeness of what was constructed. This wasn't a village that grew up slowly around a reliable water source. This was a planned urban complex, laid out deliberately over an area of roughly 150 acres, with clear functional zones for ceremony, administration, residence, and agricultural support. The scale of ambition is staggering when you remember the date. Around 2600 BCE, when construction at Caral was in full swing, the Great Pyramid of Giza was either just beginning or still a decade or two in the future. The two civilizations were genuinely contemporary. We think of ancient Egypt and the great Mesopotamian cities as the fountainheads of civilization, and they were, but they were not alone. On the other side of the world, on a dry Peruvian coast, humans were making the same fundamental leap toward urban complexity, independently from their own resources, drawing on their own understanding of the world. What they built. The most visually dramatic element of Caral, the thing that stops you when you see photographs of the site, is the pyramids. There are 6 large pyramidal mounds at Caral, plus a number of smaller ones, arranged across the urban complex in a pattern that reflects both practical function and astronomical alignment. They are not the sharp-angled pyramids of Egyptian imagination. They are platform pyramids, step structures with flat tops, more akin in appearance to the ziggurat tradition of Mesopotamia, though they were built entirely independently of it. The largest, which archaeologists have named the Pyramid Mayor, stretches approximately 160 meters in length and rises about 18 meters above the surrounding plain. It was constructed in stages over generations, each new phase of building added on top of or encasing the previous one, growing the structure upward and outward across time. The interior is not hollow. It is filled with successive layers of the reed bags, called shikras, that the builders used to transport and deposit their fill material. Those bags, woven from the plants that grew along the valley's watercourses, are still intact. Thousands of years in the dry coastal air have preserved them in a state of remarkable completeness. This method of construction, filling large bags with stone and earth rubble and stacking them to build up mass, was both ingenious and efficient. It allowed large amounts of material to be moved by many people working in coordinated relays, without the need for wheeled vehicles or draft animals, neither of which Caral possessed. The bags could be carried by individuals or small teams, stacked in place, and contributed to the overall mass incrementally. The result was a construction process that was slower than modern methods, but entirely appropriate to the available technology and labor organization. The buildings that crowned the pyramid's flat tops were more architecturally elaborate. Evidence of rooms, corridors, and hearths suggests that the pyramid tops served as places of ceremony, administration, and probably elite habitation. The broad staircases leading up the faces of the pyramids were designed for access and for processional function, allowing large numbers of people to ascend or to watch others ascend during ceremonies. Around the pyramids, the broader urban complex included large sunken circular plazas, which appear to have been the city's main gathering spaces for communal ceremonies and public events. These circular courts, dug into the earth or built up with low surrounding walls, created an arena-like space that focused attention inward and could have accommodated hundreds of participants in any public ritual. The acoustics of a circular space would have amplified sound, making music and speech more audible and more effective, which may well have been a deliberate design consideration. Residential areas spread out from the monumental core of the city, with structures ranging from more elaborate compounds with multiple rooms, presumably for people of higher social status, to simpler single-room structures for the broader population. The residential distribution pattern suggests a socially stratified society, which is not surprising given the organizational demands of building and maintaining such a complex, but the nature and degree of that stratification remain subjects of active research and debate. Peace as a civilization strategy. One of the most striking aspects of Caral is what's missing in the excavations conducted since the 1990s. Across an urban site that has been occupied and built upon for centuries, archaeologists have found no weapons, no battle axes, no spearheads, no shields or armor, no defensive fortifications. None of the martial hardware that most complex ancient societies leave scattered through their archaeological record. No defensive walls surround Caral. The city was not positioned with strategic defensibility in mind. There are no mass graves suggestive of battle casualties, no burned destruction layers indicating enemy attack, no skeletal populations showing the patterns of healed and unhealed trauma wounds that characterize populations regularly engaged in combat. The absence of evidence is always a complicated argument. Absence doesn't prove peace, but the combination of no weapons, no fortifications, no battle-related trauma and skeletal remains, and a site layout that prioritizes public gathering over defensibility is suggestive. The working hypothesis among Caral's researchers is that this was, at minimum, a society that did not organize itself around military activity in the way that many contemporary and subsequent civilizations did. This is remarkable not because peace is inherently surprising, but because of the specific historical context. Caral existed in a period when other complex societies around the world were clearly engaged in warfare and organizing themselves partly around its demands. The assumption that complexity and warfare go together, that the development of cities and social hierarchies inevitably produces military competition, is one of the foundational assumptions of much historical and archaeological theory. Caral complicates that assumption in ways that are genuinely interesting. If Caral was not organized around warfare, what held it together? The evidence points toward trade and ceremony. Trade, specifically the cotton for fish exchange with coastal communities, created a network of interdependency that was mutually beneficial and therefore provided a non-military framework for regional integration. Communities that needed each other's products had strong incentives to maintain peaceful relations, and the complexity of those trade networks created enough shared interest to substitute for the coercive power that military dominance usually provides. Ceremony, the communal rituals conducted in the great plazas and atop the pyramids, served the social cohesion function that warfare sometimes provides, creating shared identity, common experience, collective investment in the survival and prosperity of the community. If you have participated together in ceremonies that mark the agricultural calendar, that celebrate the gods of the river and the sea, that create shared memory and shared meaning, you have reasons to identify with your community and to support its continuation that go beyond simple material calculation. Whether this was a deliberate piece or an incidental one, whether it reflected a conscious value system or simply the particular conditions of Caral's geographic position and trading relationships, is something that, without written records, we cannot fully know. What we can say is that for centuries, Caral appears to have managed the challenges of urban complexity without recourse to systematic violence. That is a fact worth sitting with. The sound of the city. Among the artifacts recovered from Caral's excavations, among the architectural remains and agricultural tools and evidence of trade goods, there are musical instruments. 32 flutes carved from the hollow bones of pelicans and condors. 37 cornets made from deer and llama bones. Percussion elements. Evidence of a musical tradition that was clearly not incidental but central to the culture's ceremonial life. Bone flutes are among the oldest musical instruments in the human archaeological record worldwide. The fact that they appear in abundance at Caral, carefully made and evidently used regularly, tells us something important. This was a society that invested in music, that considered the production of organized sound important enough to warrant the skilled labor of crafting instruments, that integrated music into the public and ceremonial life of the city. The sunken circular plazas, those great amphitheater-like gathering spaces at the heart of the city, would have been natural performance spaces. The circular shape focuses sound toward the center from all directions, and a musician or group of musicians performing in the center of such a space would have been audible to everyone gathered around the perimeter. This seems too convenient to be accidental. The plazas and the musical tradition likely developed in relation to each other, the architecture serving the ceremony and the ceremony determining the requirements of the architecture. Imagine an evening ceremony at Caral. The sun setting behind the coastal range to the west, the sky turning those extraordinary shades of Pacific Coast orange and purple that painters struggle to capture. People gathering in the great sunken plaza, moving down the surrounding slopes to their places, the murmur of a crowd settling into collective attention. The first notes of bone flutes rising above the ambient sound, high and clear, carrying the frequencies that travel well in open air. Drums beginning, steady and resonant, establishing a pulse. Voices joining in whatever ritual song or chant belongs to this occasion. This is not speculation about primitiveness. This is a description of sophisticated ceremonial life, organized, intentional, aesthetically developed, serving the social and spiritual needs of a complex urban community. The people of Caral didn't have writing. They didn't have metal tools, but they had music, and they had ceremony, and they had the architectural wisdom to create spaces where those things could happen at the scale their community required. The materials of their music are also telling. Condor bones and pelican bones are not agricultural byproducts. They come from the ocean and from the high peaks of the Andes, from the extremes of the geographic range that Caral's trade networks reached. The presence of condor bone flutes in a coastal valley city suggests that the birds themselves, with their association with the mountain heights and with death and rebirth in Andean cosmology, carried symbolic meaning. The choice of material for the instruments was probably not random. Feeding a city in the desert. One of the fundamental questions about any ancient city is always, how did they feed themselves? In Caral's case, the question is especially acute because the Soup Valley is desert, and the capacity for local agricultural production seems at first insufficient to support an urban population that archaeologists estimate may have reached anywhere from 3,000 to 30,000 people at its peak, the wide range reflecting genuine uncertainty in the evidence. The answer involves a combination of strategies that show considerable sophistication. The Caral people developed irrigation systems that channeled water from the Soup River across the valley floor, enabling cultivation far beyond the immediate river margins. Canal systems, the remnants of which have been identified archaeologically, allowed water to reach fields that would otherwise have been bone dry through most of the year. This hydraulic management transformed the valley's agricultural potential significantly. Cotton appears to have been among the most important crops, which at first seems counterintuitive. You can't eat cotton, but cotton's role in Caral's economy was not primarily nutritional. It was industrial in the most basic pre-industrial sense, raw material for nets. Fishing nets made from cotton thread were, in the pre-metallic Andean world, high-value technological products. The coastal fishing communities that lived within practical reach of Caral needed nets to fish the extraordinarily productive waters of the Humboldt Current. Caral had the agricultural land to grow cotton and, presumably, the labor to spin and weave it. The coastal communities had fish, both as fresh food and in the dried form that preserved well and could be transported inland. This is the exchange at the heart of Caral's economy: cotton and nets going to the coast, dried fish, and perhaps other marine products coming back. The network was sophisticated enough to represent genuine specialization, with Caral's population devoting significant agricultural and artisan labor to producing goods for trade rather than purely for local consumption. Squash, beans, and fruit trees including guava and pake were also cultivated, providing some nutritional diversity in the local agricultural output. Chili peppers appear in the archaeobotanical record. The diet that emerges from the evidence is calorie-sufficient but relatively simple, heavily dependent on the trade network for the protein that dried and fresh fish provided. This dependency on trade creates a fragility that may ultimately have been one of the factors in Caral's decline. A city whose food security depends on a stable exchange network is vulnerable in ways that a more self-sufficient agricultural community is not. Disruptions to trade routes, environmental changes affecting either the inland agricultural production or the coastal fishing yields, or the emergence of competing trade centers that redirected those networks. Any of these could have undermined the economic foundation on which Caral's urban life rested. The engineering of eternity. Caral's builders were working without metals, without wheels, without draft animals, and without any of the mechanical tools that the Old World Bronze Age societies were beginning to deploy. What they had was an understanding of structural mechanics that they had developed empirically, through the accumulated experience of building and observing and occasionally watching things collapse. The shikra bag construction technique that fills Caral's pyramids was not just practically efficient. It was also, as engineers who have studied the site have noted, seismically smart. The coastal region of Peru sits on one of the most tectonically active zones on Earth. Earthquakes are frequent and can be severe. A monolithic fill of packed earth or rubble would transmit seismic energy efficiently from the ground into the structure above, potentially causing catastrophic failure. The shikra bag fill behaves differently. The bags shift slightly relative to each other, absorbing and dissipating seismic energy rather than transmitting it directly. The result is a structure that is more resistant to earthquake damage than its simple materials might suggest. This could be a coincidence. The builders may have used shikra bags purely for their practical convenience in construction, and been lucky that the method also happened to provide seismic resilience. But given that Caral persisted through what must have been multiple significant earthquakes over centuries of occupation, and that the structures have survived to the present in recognizable form, the method was at minimum effective, and at maximum, the product of an empirical understanding of how materials behave under stress. The alignment of Caral's major structures with astronomical reference points is another indication of systematic, organized knowledge. Several of the site's principal axes and structures appear to be oriented in relation to the summer and winter solstices, the equinoxes, and potentially other astronomical events. This kind of astronomical alignment in architecture, which appears in complex societies worldwide from this period, served multiple functions. It enabled the creation of a reliable calendar for agricultural planning. It provided a sacred justification for the layout of ceremonial space, and it demonstrated the capacity of the civilization's leadership to understand and predict natural phenomena, which is a powerful source of legitimate authority. Without writing, the knowledge needed to achieve this kind of astronomical alignment was transmitted through oral tradition, through apprenticeship, through the accumulated expertise of specialist practitioners within the society. The fact that it was achieved at all speaks to the quality and depth of that transmission system. The city grows quiet. Caral endured for something like 1,000 years, a span that dwarfs most political entities in the modern world. It was occupied, built, rebuilt, and maintained from roughly 3000 BCE to roughly 1800 BCE, after which the evidence of occupation becomes sparse and ultimately vanishes. The city was abandoned. Why civilizations end is always one of history's most haunting questions, and Caral's ending leaves fewer answers than most because of the absence of written records that might have captured the experience of decline from the inside. What archaeologists can see from the outside is a picture of gradual rather than sudden abandonment, the kind of ending that results from drift rather than disaster, from the slow failure of conditions rather than from a single catastrophic blow. Environmental change is the leading candidate among current researchers. The period from roughly 1800 BCE onward shows evidence of significant climate disruption in the Andean coastal zone, likely related to increased El Niño activity. El Niño events in this region bring dramatic changes to both the marine environment and to the inland precipitation patterns. The extraordinarily productive cold water fishery along the Peruvian coast, which the Humboldt Current supports, collapses during strong El Niño events when warm water pushes south and north-moving cold water south. The anchoveta and other fish that sustain the coastal ecosystem disappear. The fish don't come back until the El Niño cycle ends. For a city whose food supply depended critically on the coastal fish trade, a major El Niño event would have been devastating. If such events became more frequent, the chronic disruption to the trade network would have progressively undermined the economic basis of urban life at Caral. Families and communities that could manage their own food security independently, that weren't dependent on a complex urban trade network, would have been better positioned to survive this kind of environmental pressure than those who had specialized within that network. There's also the possibility that Caral's regional dominance was challenged by the rise of other centers. The Soup Valley was not the only place in coastal Peru where complex societies were developing during this period, and as neighboring valleys developed their own populations, their own ceremonial centers, their own trade relationships, the specific advantages that had made Caral the hub of its regional network may have diminished. Power in network shifts. What was central can become peripheral. Whatever the specific mechanisms, the result was that the great sunken plazas of Caral fell silent. The pyramids that had required generations of coordinated labor to build were no longer maintained or added to. The population dispersed, moving to other valleys, other communities, other ways of organizing life. The flutes were laid down for the last time. The trade goods stopped moving. The city returned slowly to the desert that had always surrounded it, the wind filling the spaces between the structures with dust, the sand covering the surfaces that hands had shaped, the whole extraordinary achievement disappearing beneath the patient accumulation of time. For nearly 4,000 years, it was as though Caral had never existed. Rediscovery. The mounds in the Soup Valley were known to people who lived in the region, of course. They had always been there, visible features of the landscape, but they were interpreted as natural hills, the kind of irregular terrain features that characterize the dry Peruvian coastal landscape in many places. Without the prior expectation that something remarkable might lie beneath, there was no reason to look more closely. Peruvian scholar Paul Cossack conducted field work in the region in the 1940s and noted the mounds, suggesting that they might be archaeological in nature. His observations went largely unaccepted. The idea that this unimpressive valley might contain a site of major archaeological importance ran against the prevailing assumptions about where complex early civilization in the Americas had appeared. The real breakthrough came in the 1990s, when archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis, working with the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos, brought a focused excavation program to the site. Her team worked carefully, methodically, through the layers of accumulated material that covered the site. What they began to find exceeded even their own hopes. Monumental architecture, artifact assemblages of remarkable complexity, and crucially, organic material suitable for radiocarbon dating. When the dates came back, they were stunning. The earliest occupation levels at Caral were dating to around 2600 BCE or earlier. This was not a late pre-Columbian site. This was not even from the classic Andean period. This was contemporary with the Old Kingdom of Egypt, with the Sumerian city-states of Mesopotamia, with the early phases of the Indus Valley civilization. Caral was among the oldest cities in the world, and it was in South America. The implications for the archaeology of the Americas were immediate and significant. The long-held assumption that complex, monumental civilization in the Americas was a much later development than in the Old World had to be revised. If Caral existed at 2600 BCE, then the Americas had been developing along parallel tracks of social complexity to those seen in Afro-Eurasia, not following them centuries or millennia later. The other implication was about ceramics. In most of the world's early complex societies, ceramics, the development of fired pottery, is closely associated with the emergence of complexity. The two tend to appear together, with pottery serving as evidence for settled life, food storage, and the development of specialized labor. Caral had no pottery in its earliest and most sophisticated phases. The people who built those pyramids and organized that city did it without ceramics. This meant that pottery was not, as had sometimes been assumed, a prerequisite for urban complexity. Caral proved that cities could exist before pottery arrived. The quipu, those knotted string devices that the Inca would later use as a sophisticated information recording system, have possible precursors at Caral. A single object that might be an early quipu was recovered from the excavations. If so, it pushes the origin of this unique Andean information technology back by more than a millennium, another revision to a chronology that had previously seemed settled. What Caral means. Caral's significance is not merely chronological. It's not just a matter of pushing the start date of Andean civilization back by a few centuries. Its significance is conceptual, challenging fundamental assumptions about what civilization is, what it requires, and what forms it can take. The standard narrative of civilization's development has emphasized a short list of prerequisites: agriculture, pottery, writing, metalworking, and military organization. Caral had agriculture, certainly. It didn't have pottery in its early phases. It didn't have writing. It didn't have metalworking. And by all available evidence, it didn't have significant military organization. Yet it was unmistakably a civilization, by any reasonable definition of the term. An organized urban complex with monumental architecture, long-distance trade, social stratification, specialized labor, ceremonial life, and the ability to sustain itself across centuries. This means that the checklist of prerequisites was wrong, or at least incomplete. Civilization is not a single thing that always takes the same form. It is a range of possible organizational responses to the fundamental human challenge of living in large groups, and different environments and different cultural trajectories produce different versions of it. The Mesopotamian version, with its writing and its city-states and its long martial tradition, is not the only version. Caral is proof that the developmental pathway can be quite different and still produce something genuinely remarkable. The peaceful character of Caral, If that interpretation holds up under continued research, adds another dimension to this challenge to standard narratives. If a city of Caral's scale and sophistication can develop and persist for centuries without evidence of military organization or conflict, then the assumption that complexity inevitably produces warfare, that urban civilization inherently requires a military capacity to defend it and an aggressive capacity to expand it, is at minimum not universal. This matters beyond the purely academic. We live in a world where it is commonly assumed, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly, that violence is an inevitable companion of human complexity, that as societies become more organized and more powerful, they necessarily become more militarized. Caral doesn't prove that this assumption is entirely wrong, but it demonstrates that it is not inevitable, that other trajectories are possible, that human societies can organize themselves around trade and ceremony and collective labor rather than around military dominance, and can do so successfully, at significant scale, for substantial periods of time. The site today. Caral was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2009, recognition of its global significance that has brought both resources and attention to a place that, for most of its rediscovery period, was known mainly to specialists. The site has been developed for visitor access, with paths and interpretive signage and ongoing excavation work visible from designated observation points. Ruth Shady Solis, whose career has been largely defined by the work at Caral, continues to oversee the archaeological program there, and has been tireless in advocating for the site's protection and the resources needed to continue studying it properly. Her work has not been without controversy. Disputes over site management, resource allocation, and the application of archaeological findings have created ongoing tensions within Peruvian cultural and political institutions. The management of a World Heritage Site in a developing country with limited resources is genuinely complicated, and Caral's story in the 21st century includes those complications alongside the ongoing archaeological discoveries. The excavations continue. Each new season brings new material, new data, new refinements to the understanding of how Caral worked and what it meant. The site is large enough that significant portions have not yet been excavated at all, and future work may produce discoveries as significant as any made so far. The oldest city in the Americas still has much to say. Conservation is an ongoing challenge. The dry coastal climate that preserved the shikra bags and the organic artifacts for thousands of years is still dry, still preserving what remains, but the site faces the normal challenges of any exposed archaeological surface: wind erosion, occasional rains, the pressure of visitor access, and the long-term effects of climate patterns that may be changing as global temperatures shift. The community of researchers working on Caral and related Soup Valley sites includes archaeologists, environmental scientists, physical anthropologists, specialists in archaeobotany and archaeozoology, acoustic researchers studying the sonic properties of the ceremonial spaces, and many others. The site is big enough and complex enough to sustain a substantial research community indefinitely, and the questions it raises are interesting enough to ensure that community will continue to grow. The city speaks. There is something particular about standing in a place where people lived and built and organized their world thousands of years ago, somewhere so old that the civilization that occupied it dissolved into memory long before any of the civilizations that we consider ancient were born. The stones of Caral have been there since before Moses, before Homer, before the Trojan War, before the Shang dynasty, before any of the reference points that anchor our sense of ancient history. The people who built Caral did not know that they were building something exceptional by global standards. They were solving the problems in front of them, managing their environment, organizing their community, feeding themselves and their neighbors, creating meaning through ceremony and music and the shared labor of construction. They were, in the most fundamental sense, just people, trying to build good lives in the place and time they inhabited. That they did so without warfare, without writing, without pottery, without metal tools, and without any of the standard prerequisites of civilization means that they were doing it their way, a way adapted to their specific environment, their specific resources, and their specific social inheritance. The result was a city that lasted 1,000 years and produced a legacy that, once rediscovered, has genuinely changed how we understand the human story. We don't know their names. We don't know the names of the leaders who organized the construction projects, the priests who conducted the ceremonies in the sunken plazas, the traders who maintained the networks that carried fish inland and cotton to the coast, the craftspeople who carved those bone flutes. We know only what they left behind. The mounds in the desert, the reed bags still holding their fill after 5,000 years, the impressions of music making and ceremony holding and city building on a scale that required cooperation and organization and collective will. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is evidence of a human capacity for achievement that transcends the specific forms we've come to expect achievement to take. Evidence that the drive to build, to organize, to create meaning, to reach beyond the immediate and the individual toward something larger and more lasting, is not a product of any particular cultural tradition or geographical advantage. It's just what people do when they're paying attention to what's possible. It's just what we are.